The lantern cast a feeble glow against the driving snow, its light barely reaching beyond Mason Hayes's hunched shoulders. His breath clouded in the bitter air as he drove the shovel into the frozen ground again. The night was silent save for the howl of the wind across the Nebraska plains and the scrape of metal against earth and stone. Mason paused, leaning on the shovel's handle, his weathered face etched with determination. 10 years had carved deep lines around his eyes, but it was more than time that had aged him. It was memory. It was loss. It was promises unkept. He resumed digging, each thrust more forceful than the last, as if the soil itself were his enemy. Finally, the blade struck something solid, not bedrock, but wood. He fell to his knees, gloved hands scraping away the remaining dirt to reveal a small box roughly the size of a Bible. His fingers, stiff with cold, worked the simple latch. Inside lay 3 treasures, a military pendant with a tarnished eagle emblem, a stack of letters bound with twine, and a daguerreotype in a simple frame. Mason lifted the photograph, barely visible in the dim lantern light. 2 men in Union Army uniforms stood side by side, their resemblance unmistakable despite their different ranks. Brothers in blood and battle. Mason stared at the image for a long moment, snow collecting on his shoulders and hat brim. 10 years, Owen, he whispered to the howling prairie night. I still haven't kept my promise. He returned the items to the box, tucked it inside his coat, and began filling in the hole. Some secrets belonged beneath the earth. Others, he was learning, refused to stay buried. The cabin sat alone on the prairie, a solitary sentinel against the vastness of the plains. A thin ribbon of smoke rose from its stone chimney, bending eastward in the persistent wind. Mason guided his horse through the deepening snow, the box from the grave secure against his chest. Inside the cabin was Spartan but tidy. A fire burned low in the hearth, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Mason removed his snow-crusted coat and hat, hanging them by the door. The cabin was laid out simply: a main room with a cooking area, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, and a small sitting area near the hearth. In one corner stood his own bed, and beside it, a shelf holding books, mostly practical guides to farming and animal husbandry, a few military histories, and a dust-covered Bible. In the opposite corner, partially hidden behind a curtain, were 2 small beds neatly made but untouched for years. Beside them sat a wooden chest painted with flowers, closed tight, as if to contain not just its contents, but the memories they carried. Mason placed the box on the table and carefully extracted its contents. He spread the letters before him, but did not open them. He knew their contents by heart, each word a reminder of his failure. The photograph he propped against a lantern, the faces of the 2 soldiers watching him as he moved about the cabin. He stoked the fire, put coffee on to boil, and cut a slice of yesterday's bread. As he ate in silence, his eyes repeatedly drifted to the empty beds in the corner, to the chest of toys that would never again be opened by small, eager hands. 5 years had passed since the flood had taken Sarah and their 2 daughters, Lily and Rose, aged 7 and 5. The creek that nourished his land had swollen with spring melt and relentless rain, sweeping away the wagon as they returned from town. Mason had reached Lily's hand, their fingers touching for the briefest moment before the current tore her away. He'd searched for 3 days before finding their bodies downstream, serene, as if sleeping, carried to the base of a cottonwood tree. He'd buried them on the hill overlooking the cabin where wildflowers bloomed in spring. After the funeral, he'd packed away their belongings, unable to part with them, but unable to bear their sight. Only the beds remained a monument to what once was. A sharp knock at the door startled Mason from his reverie. He frowned, checking the old clock on the mantel. Midnight had come and gone. No neighbor would call at this hour, especially not in such weather. Moving cautiously, he opened the door a crack. The wind immediately forced it wider, bringing a swirl of snow and revealing a small figure on his porch, a girl no more than 8, her thin shoulders hunched against the cold. In her arms, she clutched a bundle of blankets from which emerged tiny mewling sounds. "Mister," the girl said, her voice barely audible above the wind, "Mom didn't come back last night. We're alone." She shifted the bundle in her arms, revealing a baby's reddened face. "My brother's hungry." Mason stood frozen, one hand still on the door. The girl's dark eyes, wide with fear, but determined, met his. For a moment, he saw Lily in her gaze, the same stubborn courage his daughter had shown when facing thunderstorms or barn spiders. He stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in." The girl hesitated, her eyes darting past him to survey the cabin's interior. Mason recognized the caution of someone who had learned that safety could not be taken for granted. "I won't hurt you," he said, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "It's too cold for talking on the porch." Finally, she stepped inside, her movements careful, as if the floor might give way beneath her feet. Mason closed the door against the storm and turned to study his unexpected visitors. The girl was small for her age, with dark hair escaping from 2 braids. Her dress was worn, but clean, her coat too thin for the Nebraska winter. The baby in her arms couldn't have been more than 6 months old, his face scrunched in hunger or discomfort. "Sit," Mason said, gesturing to a chair near the fire. "You're half frozen." She perched on the edge of the chair, still clutching her brother tightly. Her eyes moved constantly, taking in every detail of the cabin. They lingered on the military pendant Mason had placed on the table, a flicker of recognition crossing her face before she quickly looked away. Mason warmed milk on the stove, recalling distant memories of his own children. He tore a clean strip from a dish towel, soaked the end in the warm milk, and offered it to the girl. "For the baby," he explained. "Let him suck on it." She took it cautiously and placed the milk-soaked cloth against her brother's lips. The infant latched on immediately, his tiny hands flailing before settling into a rhythm of desperate suckling. "What's your name?" Mason asked, keeping his distance. The girl's chin lifted slightly. "Emily. Emily Warren. This is Caleb." "Where's your home, Emily?" "Edge of town, by the smithy." Her voice was steady, but her eyes remained wary. "Mom went to find work in Oak Ridge. She said she'd be back yesterday." Mason nodded slowly. "And your father?" A shadow crossed her young face. "He died. In the war." The words landed like stones in still water, rippling through Mason's consciousness. The war had ended 11 years ago, but this child couldn't be much more than 8. Her father must have survived the fighting, only to succumb later, perhaps to wounds or illness. "I'm sorry," he said, the words inadequate but sincere. Emily said nothing, focusing on feeding Caleb. When the cloth dried, Mason soaked it again in milk and returned it to her. He cut bread and cheese, placing it before her on a small plate. "Eat," he said. "You need strength to care for him." She eyed the food with barely concealed hunger, but didn't reach for it. "It's not charity," Mason added, recognizing her pride. "It's neighborly." Only then did she take a small bite, then another faster, her body's needs overriding her caution. Mason sat across from her, giving her space, his mind churning with uncomfortable questions. What would he do with these children? He couldn't send them back into the storm, but he was ill-equipped to care for them. He had milk enough for a few days, but the baby would need proper care. "You can stay tonight," he decided aloud. "Tomorrow we'll find your mother, or someone in town to help." Emily's shoulders relaxed slightly, though her eyes remained alert. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," he supplied. "Mason Hayes." She nodded solemnly, then her gaze drifted to the pendant on the table again. This time, Mason caught the recognition in her eyes. "You know this?" he asked, touching the eagle emblem. Emily hesitated before answering. "My dad had one. Mom keeps it in a box with his letters." Mason's hand stilled on the pendant. "Your father was a soldier." "What unit?" "20th Maine," she said proudly. He was a corporal. Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter night. The 20th Maine, his regiment, and later Owen's. He studied the girl more carefully now, noting the shape of her chin, the set of her eyes. There was something hauntingly familiar about her features. "What was your father's name?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Owen," she replied. "Owen Warren." The name struck Mason like a physical blow. He turned away quickly, moving to the stove to hide his reaction. Owen Warren, his half-brother, discovered too late, lost too soon. The man in the photograph whose promise he had failed to keep. "Did you know him?" Emily asked, a thread of hope in her voice. Mason composed himself before turning back. "I served with many men," he said, the evasion tasting bitter on his tongue. "The name is familiar." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth she deserved. Yet what could he tell this child? That the man in the photograph with him was her father, that they had discovered their shared blood only in the chaos of war when it was already too late. "You should rest," he said instead. "You can take that bed there." He pointed to Lily's bed, the words catching in his throat. "I'll make a place for the baby." Emily looked at the small bed with its faded quilt, then at the chest beside it. "Whose bed is it?" "My daughter's." Mason said, the admission painful. "She's gone now." Understanding dawned in Emily's young eyes. "I'm sorry," she echoed his earlier sentiment. Mason nodded, unable to speak further on the subject. He found a drawer and lined it with blankets, creating a makeshift cradle for Caleb. Emily reluctantly placed her brother in it, her hands lingering as if afraid he might disappear. "I'll be right here," Mason assured her, pointing to his own bed across the room. "Nothing will harm you in this house." Emily climbed into Lily's bed, fully clothed, her small body tense beneath the quilt. Mason extinguished all but one lantern and settled into his own bed, though he knew sleep would elude him. His mind raced with the implications of Owen's children appearing at his door like ghosts from the past. Was it coincidence or something more? And where was their mother? Through the night he listened to the steady breathing of the children and the howling of the wind outside. Twice he rose to add wood to the fire. Once he stood over the drawer where Caleb slept, studying the infant's face for traces of Owen. In the darkest hour before dawn, he heard Emily whimpering in her sleep. Instinctively, he moved to her side, gently placing a hand on her shoulder, as he had done countless times with his own daughters. "Shh," he whispered. "You're safe." She quieted, turning toward his voice without waking. In sleep, her face lost its wariness, revealing the child beneath the forced maturity. Mason felt something shift inside him, a door long closed, creaking open, just a fraction. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world buried in white silence. Mason rose early, stoked the fire, and prepared breakfast. The smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the cabin, and Emily stirred, sitting up with a start when she didn't recognize her surroundings. "Morning," Mason said quietly, not wanting to frighten her. "Your brother slept through the night." Emily slipped from the bed and went immediately to check on Caleb, her small hands adjusting his blankets with practiced care. Satisfied, she turned to Mason. "Thank you for letting us stay," she said with formal politeness. "Hungry?" he asked, placing a plate on the table. She nodded, and they ate in silence. Mason watched as she carefully saved half her portion, wrapping it in her handkerchief. "For later," she explained when she caught his questioning look. "For Caleb when he's hungry again." Mason felt a pang at her careful rationing, the habit of someone who had known scarcity. "There's plenty," he assured her. "You don't need to save it." She tucked the handkerchief away, regardless, a lesson too deeply learned to be easily abandoned. After breakfast, Mason helped her prepare milk for Caleb, showing her how to keep the cloth clean and the milk at the right temperature. "You're good with babies," she observed as he demonstrated. "Had 2 of my own," he said simply. Emily nodded, absorbing this information alongside what he had told her the night before. "And they're gone now, like my dad." "Yes," Mason said, not elaborating. "Now we should head to town. Find your mother or someone who can help." Emily's face fell. "Mom won't be there. She went to Oak Ridge for work." "Then we'll find the sheriff or a neighbor who knows you." The girl's hands tightened around Caleb. "Don't make us go to the orphanage. Please. Mom will come back. I know she will." Mason sighed. The nearest orphanage was in Lincoln, a 3-day journey in good weather. Even if he were inclined to take them there, which he wasn't, the winter roads made it impossible. "No orphanage," he promised. "But we need to let people know you're safe." Emily seemed to accept this compromise. Mason bundled them all against the cold, wrapping Caleb especially well. He saddled his horse, lifting Emily and the baby onto its back before leading them toward town, following the road now barely visible beneath the snow. The town of Prairie Creek was small but vital, serving the surrounding farms and ranches. A single main street housed the Essentials General Store, Smithy Saloon, Church, and Sheriff's Office. As they approached, Mason noted the usual morning activity, smoke rising from chimneys, a few wagons navigating the snow-covered streets. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. Heads turned as Mason led his horse down the main street, the small girl and infant on its back, drawing curious stares. He headed directly for the sheriff's office, helping Emily down before tying the horse to the hitching post. Sheriff Miller looked up from his desk as they entered, his bushy eyebrows rising at the sight of Mason with 2 children in tow. "Hayes?" he greeted, surprise evident in his voice. Mason rarely came to town except for supplies. "What's this about? These children showed up at my cabin last night," Mason explained. "Their mother's missing." Miller's gaze shifted to Emily. "Warren kids, aren't they Rebecca's?" Emily nodded, stepping closer to Mason's side. "Their mother went to Oak Ridge for work," Mason continued. "Was due back yesterday." Miller stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "Heard she was looking for work. Time's been hard since Owen passed." "You know about their situation?" Mason asked. "Small town," Miller shrugged. "Rebecca's been struggling. Proud woman, though, doesn't take charity easily." He studied Mason curiously. "How did they end up at your place? You're 5 miles out." Before Mason could answer, the door opened, bringing a blast of cold air and a well-dressed man in his 50s. His coat was fine wool, his boots polished despite the snow, and his bearing suggested someone accustomed to authority. "Sheriff Miller," the man said, removing his hat to reveal silver-streaked dark hair. "I was just coming to see you about—" He stopped, noticing Mason and the children. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Ah, I see someone's found the Warren children. Excellent." Miller stood. "Mr. Thornton." "Yes, they turned up at Mr. Hayes's ranch last night." Henry Thornton Mason knew by reputation only. A businessman from back east who had settled in Prairie Creek 5 years ago, buying up land and establishing himself as a person of influence. He owned the grain mill, had interests in the bank in Oak Ridge, and was known for his charitable contributions to the church and school. "A fortunate coincidence," Thornton said smoothly, though his eyes betrayed calculation. "I was just coming to report that I've located Mrs. Warren." Emily's head snapped up. "You found Mom? Where is she?" Thornton smiled down at her, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. "She's in Oak Ridge, my dear. I'm afraid she's quite ill pneumonia, the doctor believes. She's being cared for, but she asked about you both." Mason felt Emily's small hand slip into his, her fingers cold with fear. "Is she going to die?" the girl whispered. Now," Thornton said with practiced sympathy. "She's receiving the best care, but it may be some time before she's well enough to care for you." Miller cleared his throat. "What do you propose, Mr. Thornton?" "As a concerned citizen, I've taken the liberty of contacting the children's home in Lincoln," Thornton replied. "They have space for both children until Mrs. Warren recovers, if she recovers." Emily's grip on Mason's hand tightened painfully. "No," she protested. "Mom said never to go to the orphanage. She said families get separated there." Thornton's smile thinned. "Sometimes children don't understand what's best for them." Something about the man's tone raised Mason's hackles. He studied Thornton more carefully, noting the way the businessman's gaze lingered possessively on Emily and Caleb, as if they were commodities to be claimed. "There's no need for an orphanage," Mason found himself saying. "They can stay with me until their mother recovers." 3 pairs of eyes turned to him in surprise, Miller's, Thornton's, and most of all, Emily's. "You," Thornton said with poorly disguised disdain. "A single man with no family, hardly appropriate." "More appropriate than shipping them to strangers in Lincoln," Mason countered, his voice hardening. "I have room, food, and time enough to care for them." Miller looked uncomfortable, caught between Thornton's obvious influence and Mason's unexpected offer. "It's unusual," he hedged. "A single man taking in children, especially a girl her age." "I know these children," Mason said firmly, the decision crystallizing even as he spoke. "I served with their father in the war." Emily's eyes widened at this admission, but she said nothing. "Owen Warren was under my command," Mason continued, the partial truth coming easier than expected. "Before he died, I promised to look after his family if anything happened to him. I'm keeping that promise now." It wasn't exactly a lie. He had made that promise to Owen as his half-brother lay dying, though he had failed to fulfill it until now, had not even known where to find Owen's family until they appeared at his door. Thornton's expression darkened. "A convenient claim, Mr. Hayes. Can you prove this connection?" Mason met the man's gaze steadily. "I have Owen's letters, and his military pendant. Emily recognized it last night." The girl nodded vigorously, seizing on this support. "It's true, Dad wrote about his captain who saved his life at Gettysburg." "That was you, wasn't it, Mr. Hayes?" Mason swallowed hard. He had indeed pulled Owen to safety during that bloody battle, not knowing then that they shared a father. "Yes," he said quietly. "That was me." Miller looked between them, then sighed. "Well, if there's a prior connection, I suppose they could stay with you temporarily, at least until we hear more about Mrs. Warren's condition." Thornton's jaw tightened, but he maintained his pleasant facade. "I must object, Sheriff. While Mr. Hayes's offer is admirable, these children would be better served by professionals. As chairman of the orphanage board, I can assure proper placement." "They're staying with me," Mason said with quiet finality, resting a protective hand on Emily's shoulder. Miller, clearly wanting to avoid conflict, raised his hands placatingly. "Let's compromise. The children stay with Mr. Hayes for now, but we'll need to formalize arrangements through the judge when he's next in town next week, if the weather permits." Thornton's eyes narrowed, but he nodded curtly. "Very well, but I'll be checking on their welfare regularly, and when the judge arrives, we'll revisit this arrangement." The threat in his words was thinly veiled. Mason nodded, equally curt. "We'll be ready." As they left the sheriff's office, Emily looked up at Mason with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. "Did you really know my dad?" she asked once they were out of earshot. Mason adjusted Caleb in his arms, buying time to consider his answer. "Yes," he said finally. "He was a good man. Brave." "But you didn't tell me last night," she pressed, perceptive beyond her years. "No," Mason admitted. "It's complicated. I'll explain more when we're home." Emily seemed to accept this, though her eyes remained thoughtful. As they passed the general store, Mason paused. "We need supplies. Things for you and Caleb." The store was warm and fragrant, with the smell of coffee, tobacco, and leather. Mrs. Peterson, the storekeeper's wife, looked up from her knitting, her eyes widening at the sight of Mason with the Warren children. "Mr. Hayes," she greeted, setting aside her work. "And young Emily, and little Caleb. My goodness." News traveled fast in Prairie Creek. Mason nodded politely, then began selecting items: cloth diapers for Caleb, a warmer coat for Emily, milk sugar, and other necessities. Mrs. Peterson, recovering from her surprise, helped Emily choose a few essentials while casting curious glances at Mason. "I heard Rebecca's taken ill," she said as she wrapped their purchases. "Such a shame. She's had more than her share of hardship." Mason made a non-committal sound, paying for the goods. Mrs. Peterson leaned closer, lowering her voice. "It's good of you to help these children, Mr. Hayes. Not everyone would." Her approval seemed genuine, though Mason detected an undercurrent of curiosity. He nodded again and gathered their purchases, anxious to leave before more questions arose. Outside, they found Henry Thornton waiting beside Mason's horse, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Hayes," he said smoothly. "A word, if I may." Mason helped Emily onto the horse, then turned to face Thornton, keeping his body between the businessman and the children. "What is it?" Thornton stepped closer, his voice dropping to ensure privacy. "I'm curious about your sudden interest in these children. You've lived as a hermit for 5 years, avoiding town, avoiding people. Now you're claiming connection to a dead soldier and responsibility for his family." "I don't owe you explanations," Mason replied evenly. "Perhaps not me," Thornton conceded with a thin smile. "But the judge will require them, and he'll want to know why a man with your history should be entrusted with children." Mason felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "What do you know about my history?" "Enough," Thornton said. "I make it my business to know about the people and property in this county. Your land, for instance, 160 acres of prime bottomland, including the creek that feeds half the county's farms." Ah, Mason thought, now we come to it. "My land isn't for sale, Thornton. Never has been, never will be." The businessman's smile remained fixed. "Everyone has a price, Hayes, or a pressure point." His gaze flicked meaningfully to Emily and Caleb. "Consider carefully what's at stake before the judge arrives." With that, he tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Mason seething with quiet anger. The implication was clear. Thornton wanted his land and would use the children as leverage. The question was why the property was good, certainly, but nothing extraordinary in a county full of farmland. "What did he want?" Emily asked as Mason mounted behind her. "Nothing important." Mason lied, unwilling to burden her with adult concerns. "Let's go home." As they rode back to the cabin, Mason's mind churned with the morning's revelations. Owen's children had found their way to him seemingly by chance. Thornton had somehow learned of Rebecca's illness before anyone else, and had already contacted the orphanage. And now the businessman was threatening to use Mason's past, his withdrawal from society after his family's death, perhaps to challenge his guardianship of the children. None of it felt like coincidence. But what was the connection? What did Thornton really want? The answer would have to wait. For now, Mason had two children depending on him, children who belonged to his half-brother, children who were by blood, if not by name, his family. "We're almost there," he told Emily as the cabin came into view, smoke still rising from its chimney. "Almost home." The word felt strange on his tongue after so many years of emptiness. Home. Not just shelter, but something more. Something he had thought lost forever in the floodwaters that took his family. Emily turned slightly, looking up at him with her father's eyes. "Thank you for not letting them take us away." Mason's throat tightened. "No one's going to take you away," he promised, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm going to keep you safe." It was the same promise he had made to Owen as his brother lay dying on a battlefield in Pennsylvania. A promise he had failed to keep until now. Perhaps this was his second chance. Perhaps this was redemption. Or perhaps he thought, as the wind carried the first flakes of a new storm, it was simply the right thing to do. The next few days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Mason, long accustomed to solitude, found himself adjusting to the presence of children in his home. Emily, initially wary, gradually relaxed as she realized Mason posed no threat. She helped with small chores, watched carefully as he prepared bottles for Caleb, and explored the cabin with quiet curiosity. The first real test came on the third night, when Mason woke to find Emily standing beside his bed, her small face solemn in the dying firelight. "You were calling names in your sleep," she said. "Who's Owen and Sarah?" Mason sat up slowly, the remnants of the nightmare still clinging to him like cobwebs. "Owen was your father," he admitted. "Sarah was my wife." Emily settled on the edge of his bed, hugging her knees. "You have bad dreams too." "Sometimes," he said. "Me too," she confessed. "About Dad dying. About Mom not coming back." Mason's heart twisted at the matter-of-fact way she spoke of such fears. No child should bear such burdens. "Your mother will come back," he assured her, though he had no way of knowing if it was true. Emily nodded, though doubt shadowed her eyes. "Can I ask you something, Mr. Hayes?" "Mason," he corrected gently. "And yes. How did you know my dad really?" The question hung in the darkness between them, weighted with all Mason had not yet told her. He considered deflecting again, but something in her steady gaze, so like Owen's, demanded honesty. "Let me show you something," he said, reaching for the box he had retrieved from its burial place. He opened it, removed the photograph, and handed it to her. "This is your father and me, during the war." Emily studied the image intently, her finger tracing the outline of Owen's face. "You look alike," she observed with a child's directness. "Yes," Mason acknowledged. "We were close." "Were you friends?" Mason hesitated. "Brothers in arms." He said the phrase both truth and evasion. Emily continued to study the photograph, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Dad wrote letters to Mom," she said slowly. "She reads them to me sometimes. He mentioned a captain who saved his life." She looked up, eyes searching Mason's face. "That was you, wasn't it?" "Yes," Mason said, his voice rough with memory. "At Gettysburg. He was wounded, trapped under fire. I carried him back to our lines." Emily nodded, absorbing this. "And you promised to look after us if anything happened to him." "I did." Mason confirmed the admission, both painful and relieving. "But after the war, I lost track of him. I didn't know where he had settled or that he had a family." Another partial truth he had known of Owen's marriage but had deliberately avoided contact, buried in his own grief after Sarah's death. "But now we've found you," Emily said, a note of wonder in her voice. "Or you found us?" "Yes," Mason agreed, struck by the simple truth of it. Whether by chance or providence, Owen's children had come to him when they needed protection most. "Now we found each other." Emily returned the photograph carefully, then impulsively wrapped her arms around Mason's neck in a brief, fierce hug. "Thank you for keeping your promise," she whispered before slipping back to her own bed. Mason sat motionless, the ghost of her embrace, lingering like warmth after a fire. It was the first time since the flood that anyone had embraced him, the first human touch that had broken through his carefully constructed walls of isolation. He returned the photograph to its box, his fingers lingering on the image of himself and Owen. Half-brothers who had discovered their connection too late, who had had only months to know each other before Owen was wounded at Gettysburg and later died of those wounds after returning home. Brothers who shared a father. Jeremiah Hayes, who had abandoned Owen's mother before his birth, only to start a new family with Mason's mother years later. The tangle of family secrets and obligations weighed heavy on Mason's mind as he tried to return to sleep. What would Emily think if she knew the full truth that Mason was her uncle by blood? Would she feel betrayed by his partial revelations? Or would she embrace the connection? And what of Thornton's veiled threats? The businessman clearly wanted Mason's land and saw the children as leverage. But why the urgency? What made the property suddenly valuable enough to orchestrate such machinations? Morning brought no answers, but it did bring a visitor. Eleanor Quinn, the widow who lived on the neighboring farm, arrived shortly after breakfast with a basket over her arm. "Thought you might need some help with the little ones," she announced without preamble as Mason opened the door. A woman in her 60s with iron-gray hair and practical clothing, Eleanor had been one of the few neighbors Mason maintained contact with after his withdrawal from society. "Mrs. Quinn," he greeted, surprised, but not displeased. "Come in." Eleanor swept into the cabin with the efficiency of someone accustomed to taking charge. She nodded approvingly at the tidiness of the space, then turned her attention to Emily and Caleb. "So these are the Warren children," she said, her tone softening as she addressed Emily. "I knew your mother, child, a fine woman and a good nurse. She helped deliver my grandson 2 years ago." Emily, initially hesitant, warmed to Eleanor's straightforward manner. "Is Mom going to be okay?" She asked the question she had been holding back with Mason. Eleanor's face grew serious. "Pneumonia's no trifle, especially in winter. But your mother's strong and she has good reason to fight." She glanced at Mason. "I'll be riding to Oak Ridge tomorrow to check on her myself." Mason nodded gratefully. "Please, tell her the children are safe." "I'll do better than that," Eleanor declared, unpacking her basket to reveal fresh bread preserves and a small dress that had clearly belonged to her granddaughter. "I'll bring her a letter from Emily and anything else you want to send." The morning passed with Eleanor showing Mason how to properly bathe Caleb, offering advice on childcare, and teaching Emily to knit. Her practical help was invaluable, but even more valuable was the normality she brought to the strange new household, the sense that perhaps this unconventional arrangement could work. As she prepared to leave, Eleanor drew Mason aside. "You've done a good thing taking them in," she said quietly. "But Thornton won't make it easy for you." "You know about his interest?" Mason asked, surprised. Eleanor's mouth thinned. "My late husband was his bookkeeper for a time. Thornton's been buying up land all through the county, quietly using different names. Something's afoot, though I don't know what. He's offered to buy my place before," Mason said. "I always refused." "Keep refusing," Eleanor advised. "And watch those children closely. Thornton doesn't take no for an answer easily. After she left, Mason found Emily sitting by the fire staring intently at the Bible on the shelf. He realized she had been unusually quiet during Eleanor's visit, absorbing everything but volunteering little. "Would you like to read it?" he asked, nodding toward the Bible. Emily shook her head. "I can't read very well yet. Mom was teaching me, but—" She trailed off, her small shoulders slumping. Mason retrieved the Bible and sat beside her. "I could teach you," he offered, "if you'd like." Emily looked up, hope brightening her face. "Really, really," Mason confirmed, opening the book. "My wife was a school teacher before we married. She taught our daughters." The memory brought pain, but less sharp than before. "I'm not as good a teacher as she was, but I know the basics." He turned to a page marked with a faded ribbon, Isaiah, the passage he had read at Sarah and the girl's funeral. "The Lord is my strength and my song," he read aloud. "He has become my salvation." Emily listened intently, her eyes following his finger across the page. "What does it mean?" she asked when he finished. Mason considered the question one he had wrestled with himself in the dark years after his loss. "It means that even in our darkest times, there's hope," he said finally. "It means we're never truly alone." Emily nodded solemnly. "Mom says that too. She says the people we love never really leave us." "Your mother sounds wise," Mason said, his throat tight. "She is," Emily agreed. Then, hesitantly, "Can I tell you a secret, Mason?" "Of course." Emily glanced toward Caleb sleeping peacefully in his makeshift cradle. "Sometimes I'm scared I'll forget what Dad looked like. It's been 2 years and his face gets blurry in my head." Mason set the Bible aside and took her small hands in his. "I have an idea," he said gently. He retrieved the box and removed the photograph again. "Would you like to keep this? So you'll always remember him." Emily's eyes widened. "Really? But it's yours." "I have my memories," Mason said. "And you're his daughter. You should have it." Tears welled in Emily's eyes as she accepted the photograph, clutching it to her chest, as if it were made of gold. "Thank you," she whispered. In that moment, something shifted between them, a fragile trust, forming a bridge spanning the chasm of their separate losses. Mason realized with sudden clarity that in trying to help these children, he might be saving himself as well. The quiet moment was interrupted by a knock at the door, sharp, authoritative, unlike Eleanor's friendly rap. Mason rose, instinctively positioning himself between the door and the children. Sheriff Miller stood on the porch, his expression grave. Behind him, Henry Thornton waited with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hayes," Miller said with a nod. "Need a word." Mason stepped outside, pulling the door nearly closed behind him. "What's this about?" Miller shifted uncomfortably. "Got some news about Mrs. Warren. She's taken a turn for the worse. Doctor says—" He glanced at Thornton, then back to Mason. "Well, he's not optimistic." Mason felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. "How bad?" "Bad enough that arrangements need to be considered," Thornton interjected smoothly, "for the children's future." Mason's jaw tightened. "They have arrangements. They're staying with me." "Temporarily," Thornton corrected, "and now circumstances have changed. I've spoken with Judge Wilson by telegraph. He's agreed to hear the matter as soon as the road's clear, likely within the week." "What matter?" Mason demanded. "Your fitness as guardian," Thornton said, his voice hardening slightly. "A single man, with no experience raising children, living in isolation, with a history of instability after your family's tragic demise." The calculated cruelty of the words struck Mason like a physical blow. He took a step toward Thornton, fists clenched, but Miller placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Easy, Hayes," the sheriff warned. "This is legal business, not personal." But it was personal, Mason knew. Thornton's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of having found a pressure point. Mason's grief, his withdrawal from society after losing his family. "The children stay with me until the hearing," Mason said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And I'll be visiting Mrs. Warren myself to see this turn for the worse with my own eyes." Thornton's smile widened fractionally. "By all means, though I'd advise against bringing the children. Seeing their mother in such a state would be traumatic." Something in his tone raised Mason's suspicions further. Was Rebecca truly worsening, or was this another of Thornton's manipulations? "I'll ride to Oak Ridge tomorrow," Mason decided aloud. "Mrs. Quinn has offered to stay with the children." "Very well," Thornton conceded with a slight nod. "Until the hearing, then." He turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing, Hayes. I'd reconsider my offer for your land. A favorable price might make other matters simpler." The implication was clear: sell the land, and Thornton would withdraw his challenge to Mason's guardianship. It was blackmail, plain and simple. "My land isn't for sale," Mason repeated firmly, "and neither is my integrity." Thornton's expression hardened momentarily before smoothing into practiced pleasantness. "We'll see," he said mildly, and walked away. Miller lingered, looking uncomfortable. "Hayes, I don't know what's between you and Thornton, but tread carefully. He has influence with the judge." "And what about you, Sheriff?" Mason asked. "Where do you stand?" Miller sighed, rubbing his mustache. "I stand with what's right for those children. If that's with you, I'll support it. But Thornton has raised some valid concerns that the judge will consider." After Miller left, Mason returned inside to find Emily standing just beyond the door, her face pale. She had heard everything. "Is Mom really dying?" she asked, her voice small. Mason crouched to meet her eyes. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "But I'm going to find out. And no matter what happens, I promise to keep you and Caleb safe. I mean to keep that promise." Emily studied his face, searching for reassurance. "That man, Mr. Thornton, he wants to take us away. Why?" Mason hesitated, weighing how much to tell her. "He wants my land," he said finally. "And he thinks you and Caleb are a way to pressure me." "Because of the gold?" Emily asked innocently. Mason stared at her, stunned. "What gold?" Emily's eyes widened as she realized she had said something significant. I don't know, really. I heard Mom and Dad talking once before he died. Dad said there might be gold in the creek that runs through your land, but it was a secret." Mason's mind raced. Gold in Prairie Creek. It seemed far-fetched, yet it would explain Thornton's determination to acquire his property. But how would Owen have known? "Emily," he said carefully, "did your father ever mention anything else about the creek or my land?" She frowned in concentration. "He said something about a survey, that he'd seen a survey that showed—" She trailed off, struggling to remember. "I don't know." It was grown-up talk. A survey. Mason thought back to his last conversations with Owen during the war. His half-brother had mentioned working for the territorial government before enlisting surveying land for settlement. Had he discovered something then about Mason's land? It was a tenuous connection, but it fit the pieces together. Owen's knowledge, Thornton's sudden interest, the pressure to gain control of the property. If there was gold in Prairie Creek, it would transform the entire county and make its owner extraordinarily wealthy. "Emily," Mason said, his decision crystallizing, "tomorrow we're going to visit your mother. I need to speak with her, and you need to see her." The girl's face lit up. "Really? You'll take me to Mom?" "Yes," Mason promised. "And together, we'll get to the bottom of this mystery." That night, as Emily slept, and Caleb cooed softly in his makeshift cradle, Mason stood at the window watching the stars emerge above the snow-covered prairie. The land that had been his refuge might now be the key to protecting Owen's children if he could uncover the truth in time. He thought of the photograph Emily now kept beneath her pillow of the two brothers who had found each other too late, of promises made and kept and broken, of second chances. "I won't fail them, Owen," he whispered to the night sky. "This time, I'll keep my promise." The wind answered with a low moan across the chimney, carrying the first whispers of another storm. Mason knew the journey to Oak Ridge would be difficult, perhaps dangerous. But some risks were worth taking. For family, for redemption, for the truth that lay buried beneath the snow, waiting to be uncovered, like the box he had dug from the frozen earth. A truth that might change everything. Dawn broke cold and clear over the prairie, the rising sun painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. Mason stood on the porch of his cabin, watching as Eleanor Quinn's wagon approached along the rutted trail. Despite the early hour, she drove with purpose, her figure bundled against the morning chill. He glanced back through the window at Emily, who sat near the fire brushing her hair, her movements quick with excitement. She had hardly slept, too eager for their journey to Oak Ridge, too hopeful about seeing her mother. Mason hadn't had the heart to temper her expectations, though Thornton's ominous words about Rebecca's worsening condition lingered in his mind. Eleanor reined in her team before the cabin, her breath clouding in the frigid air. "Good morning, Mason," she called, her voice carrying in the stillness. "Fine day for a journey, if you don't mind the cold." Mason nodded, lifting a hand in greeting. "Appreciate you watching, Caleb," he said as he approached the wagon. "Emily and I should be back by nightfall." "Take whatever time you need," Eleanor replied, climbing down with the spryness of a much younger woman. "That baby and I will get along just fine." She studied Mason's face, her sharp eyes missing nothing. "You're worried." It wasn't a question. Mason adjusted his hat, buying time before answering. "Thornton came by yesterday. Claims Rebecca's taken a turn for the worse." Eleanor's expression darkened. "That man," she muttered, "always working an angle. Well, you'll see the truth for yourself soon enough." She patted his arm, a gesture of unexpected comfort. "Give Rebecca my regards. Tell her she's not alone." Inside, Emily had donned her new coat, one of the items Mason had purchased in town, and was carefully wrapping a small bundle. "Presents for Mom," she explained when she caught Mason watching. "A drawing I made, and one of Caleb's blankets so she can smell him." The simple thoughtfulness of the gesture tightened Mason's throat. "That's a fine idea," he managed. "She'll like that." Eleanor entered immediately, moving to the cradle where Caleb slept. "There's our little man," she cooed, then turned to Emily with a warm smile. "Don't you worry about your brother, dear Mrs. Quinn has raised 5 children and helped with 8 grandchildren. He'll be in good hands." Emily nodded, though she lingered near the cradle, reluctant to leave her brother. Since their arrival at Mason's cabin, she had rarely let Caleb out of her sight, assuming a responsibility far beyond her years. Now she leaned down to kiss his forehead, whispering something too soft for the adults to hear. "We'd best get started," Mason said gently. "It's a good 4 hours to Oak Ridge, longer if the roads are bad." Emily straightened, squaring her small shoulders with determination. "I'm ready." Mason had saddled his strongest horse, knowing the journey would tax the animal. He lifted Emily into the saddle, then mounted behind her, settling her securely against his chest. The morning was bitter cold, the kind that burned the lungs with each breath, but the sky was clear, promising fair weather for their journey. "Remember what I told you," Eleanor called as they prepared to depart. "Rebecca Warren is made of stern stuff. Don't believe everything Thornton says." Mason nodded, appreciating the older woman's forthrightness. With a gentle nudge, he set the horse in motion, guiding it toward the eastern horizon where Oak Ridge lay. The landscape stretched before them, vast and pristine in its winter mantle. Prairie Creek was visible as a dark line winding through the snow, its waters partially frozen, but still flowing beneath the ice. Mason's eyes followed its course, considering Emily's revelation about gold. It seemed improbable the creek had flowed through his land for generations without any hint of precious metals. Yet something had drawn Thornton's covetous attention. "Mason!" Emily's voice broke into his thoughts. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "If Mom is really sick, what happens to us?" The question was asked with careful steadiness, as if she were bracing for the answer. Mason tightened his arm around her, a protective gesture that had become instinctive in the short time she'd been in his care. "You stay with me," he said simply. "Both of you. Even if Mr. Thornton tries to take us away, even then." Mason's jaw set with determination. "I made a promise to your father, Emily. I intend to keep it." She was quiet for a moment, processing this. "Why does Mr. Thornton want your land so badly?" Mason considered how much to share. "I'm not sure," he said carefully. "But what you mentioned about gold, it might explain his interest." "Do you think it's true about the gold?" "I don't know. It seems unlikely. But your father was a surveyor before the war. If anyone might have noticed something unusual about the creek, it would have been him." Emily twisted slightly to look up at him. "Dad never told me he was a surveyor." "He worked for the territorial government," Mason explained, "mapping lands for settlement. That's how he knew about my property before we met in the war." This was part of the story Owen had shared during their brief time as brothers, how he had surveyed the Hayes homestead years before, discovering his connection to Mason, how he had admired the rich bottomland and the creek that never ran dry, even in drought years. "Did Dad know you were his brother?" Emily asked suddenly. Mason nearly pulled the horse to a halt, shocked by the direct question. "What makes you ask that?" Emily's gaze was steady, unafraid. "You have the same eyes, the same chin. And last night, I heard you talking in your sleep again. You called Dad brother." Mason's heart hammered against his ribs. He had underestimated this child's perception, her ability to piece together fragments of truth. "Yes," he admitted finally. "We discovered our connection during the war. We had the same father, though different mothers." "So you're my uncle," Emily stated, the realization dawning in her voice. "My real uncle, yes? Why didn't you tell me right away?" The hurt in her question cut deeper than Mason had expected. "I wasn't sure how," he said honestly. "It's complicated. Your grandfather, my father, he abandoned Owen's mother before Owen was born. He wasn't a good man, Emily. He left my mother too, eventually." Emily absorbed this, her brow furrowed in thought. "So you and Dad didn't grow up together?" "No, we didn't even know about each other until we met in the army. I was his captain." It was only later, when we were comparing stories, that we realized the connection. "And then you became friends." Mason smiled sadly at the simplicity of her question. "Yes, brothers and friends, though we had little time together. He was wounded at Gettysburg, sent home to recover. He died of those wounds 2 years later." "I remember," Emily said softly. "I was 6. He got very pale and thin, and then one day he didn't wake up." Mason swallowed hard. imagining Owen's final days surrounded by his young family, far from the brother he had only just discovered. "I'm sorry I wasn't there." He said the words inadequate for the depth of his regret. Emily leaned back against him, a gesture of comfort unexpected from one so young. "You're here now," she said simply. They rode in silence for a time, each lost in thought. The sun climbed higher, taking the edge off the morning chill. They passed scattered farms and homesteads, smoke rising from chimneys, occasional figures working in barnyards or fields. Life continuing as it always did, regardless of personal tragedy or triumph. Near midday, they crested a low hill and saw Oak Ridge spread before them, in the valley a town larger than Prairie Creek, with several streets radiating from a central square, a proper courthouse, and various businesses. The railroad had reached Oak Ridge 2 years earlier, bringing growth and prosperity that had yet to touch Prairie Creek. "Mom said Oak Ridge has real doctors," Emily commented as they approached. "Not just the barber who pulls teeth like in Prairie Creek." Mason nodded, guiding the horse down the slope toward the town. "It does. That's why she came here, for better care for you and Caleb." And perhaps he thought, but didn't say, to escape Thornton's influence. The businessman's interest in Rebecca and her children seemed tied to his desire for Mason's land, but the exact nature of that connection remained unclear. Perhaps Rebecca herself could provide answers. They entered Oak Ridge as the town bell struck noon, the streets busier than Prairie Creeks ever were. Mason asked directions from a shopkeeper and was pointed toward a modest building near the edge of town, Dr. Parker's clinic and residence. The doctor's house was a 2-story structure with a small sign announcing his practice. Mason helped Emily down from the horse, noting how she straightened her coat and smoothed her hair, preparing to see her mother with a child's mixture of excitement and apprehension. A middle-aged woman answered their knock, her crisp apron and severe bun marking her as the doctor's assistant or housekeeper. "Yes?" she inquired, eyeing Mason's weather-worn clothing with faint disapproval. "We're here to see Rebecca Warren," Mason explained. "This is her daughter, Emily." The woman's expression softened as she looked at Emily. "Oh, you poor dear. Come in, come in." She ushered them into a warm entryway. "Dr. Parker is with another patient, but I'll let him know you're here. Mrs. Warren is upstairs resting." "How is she?" Mason asked, removing his hat. "We heard her condition had worsened." The woman, Mrs. Simmons, she introduced herself, frowned slightly. "She's been quite ill, but holding her own. The fever broke yesterday, which is a good sign. Dr. Parker believes she's past the worst of it." Mason exchanged a glance with Emily, both recognizing the discrepancy between this report and Thornton's dire assessment. "May we see her?" Emily asked eagerly. "Of course, dear. Follow me." They climbed a narrow staircase to the second floor, where several rooms served as recovery wards for patients requiring ongoing care. Mrs. Simmons led them to a door at the end of the hallway, knocking softly before entering. "Mrs. Warren, you have visitors." The room was small but clean, with a single bed, a chair, and a window overlooking the town. In the bed lay a woman in her early 30s, her dark hair spread across the pillow, her face pale but no longer bearing the flush of fever. At the sound of Mrs. Simmons's voice, she turned toward the door, her eyes widening at the sight of Emily. "Emily," she breathed, her voice weak but clear. "Is it really you? Mom?" Emily rushed forward, throwing herself into her mother's outstretched arms. "I missed you so much." Rebecca Warren embraced her daughter fiercely, tears flowing freely down her hollow cheeks. "My darling girl, I'm so sorry. I never meant to leave you for so long." Mason hung back, giving them privacy for their reunion. He studied Rebecca, noting that while she was certainly thin and weak, she didn't appear to be at death's door, as Thornton had implied. Her eyes were clear, her movements, though careful, were not those of someone gravely ill. After several moments of whispered endearments and tears, Rebecca looked past Emily to where Mason stood near the door. Her eyes widened in recognition. "Captain Hayes," she asked, disbelief coloring her voice. Mason stepped forward, nodding. "Mrs. Warren, it's been a long time." Emily looked between them, confused. "You know each other?" Rebecca's grip on her daughter's hand tightened slightly. "Captain Hayes was your father's commanding officer," she explained, her eyes never leaving Mason's face. "He saved your father's life at Gettysburg." She paused, studying him more intently. "You're the one who found my children." "They found me," Mason corrected gently. "Emily brought Caleb to my cabin during the storm 3 nights ago. They were alone, hungry." Rebecca closed her eyes briefly, pain crossing her features. "I never meant to be gone so long. The work I found laundry at the hotel, it was supposed to be just for a day or two. But then the fever came on so suddenly." She looked at Emily again, stroking her hair. "I was so worried about you both. How is Caleb?" "He's good," Emily assured her. "He's with Mrs. Quinn today. She's watching him while we came to see you." "Eleanor Quinn?" Rebecca asked, looking to Mason for confirmation. When he nodded, she relaxed slightly. "She's a good woman. Kind." Mrs. Simmons, who had been hovering near the door, cleared her throat. "I'll bring some tea," she offered, then slipped out, leaving them alone. A moment of awkward silence fell. There was much to discuss, but not all of it appropriate for Emily's ears. Mason was about to suggest the girl wait downstairs when Rebecca spoke again. "Emily, darling, would you do something for me? Mrs. Simmons keeps a small garden behind the house. Even in winter, there are some hardy herbs. Would you ask her if I might have some mint for my tea? It helps my cough." Emily, eager to be helpful, nodded and hurried out, leaving the adults alone. As soon as the door closed behind her, Rebecca's demeanor changed, her expression becoming more guarded. "How did you really find my children, Captain Hayes?" she asked directly. "Just as I said. They appeared at my door during the storm." Mason moved closer, taking the chair beside her bed. "But I think the better question is why they were alone in the first place, and why Henry Thornton is so interested in them and in my land." Rebecca's face paled further at the mention of Thornton. "He's found them then," she whispered. "I was afraid of that. What does he want, Mrs. Warren? Why is he so determined to gain guardianship of your children and possession of my property?" Rebecca glanced toward the door, ensuring they were truly alone, then motioned for Mason to come closer. "It's about the gold," she said softly. Just as Owen suspected. So it was true. Mason felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter day. "Tell me everything," he urged. Rebecca gathered her strength, sitting up straighter against her pillows. Before Owen enlisted, he worked as a surveyor for the territorial government. One of the areas he surveyed was Prairie Creek, including your homestead. Mason nodded. Emily mentioned something about a survey. Yes, Owen noticed unusual deposits in the creek bed, what he believed might be gold-bearing quartz. He took samples intending to have them analyzed, but then the war came and he enlisted. Did he ever confirm his suspicions? Rebecca nodded. After he returned home wounded, he sent one of the samples to an assayer in Denver. The results came back just before he died. The sample contained gold not in huge quantities, but enough to be commercially viable with the right equipment. And Thornton knows this. Yes, Rebecca's voice hardened. Owen's former supervisor at the survey office, James Mercer, is Thornton's brother-in-law. Somehow, Mercer learned about Owen's discovery and told Thornton. After Owen died, Thornton began pressuring me to sell him the survey documents and samples. "Why didn't you?" Mason asked. Because Owen made me promise never to sell them, Rebecca replied, her eyes flashing with a hint of her former strength. He said the discovery belonged to the rightful owner of the land you. He felt a debt to you not just for saving his life, but because— She hesitated. Because we were brothers, Mason finished quietly. Rebecca's eyes widened. You knew. We discovered it during the war. It's why I promised to look after his family if anything happened to him, a promise I failed to keep until now. Rebecca's expression softened. Owen spoke of you often, especially near the end. He wanted to contact you to introduce us, but he was too weak to travel, and we didn't know how to reach you. The revelation struck Mason like a physical blow. Owen had wanted to connect to introduce their families, while Mason had been isolating himself in grief after losing Sarah and the girls. Another missed opportunity, another regret to carry. Thornton has been relentless, Rebecca continued. At first he just offered money. When I refused, he began making threats subtle at first, then more overt. He claimed he could have the children removed from my care, that a widow with no means couldn't provide properly for them. And so you came to Oak Ridge to escape him? Yes. I found work at the hotel, but the pay was poor, the hours long. I had to leave the children alone more than I wanted. Her voice broke. When I fell ill, I feared the worst, that Thornton would find them, use them somehow. He's trying, Mason confirmed grimly. He's arranged a hearing with Judge Wilson next week to challenge my guardianship of Emily and Caleb. You can't let him take them, Rebecca said urgently, grasping Mason's hand. Owen's survey notes are hidden in our house in Prairie Creek, under a floorboard beneath Emily's bed. They prove that Thornton has known about the gold for years, but kept it secret, waiting for an opportunity to acquire the land cheaply. Why not simply file a claim himself? Because the gold is on your private property, Rebecca explained. Under territorial law, mineral rights belong to the landowner unless specified otherwise in the deed. Your family has owned that land since before those laws were established. The pieces were falling into place. Thornton couldn't mine the gold without owning the land. He had tried to buy the property from Mason directly, but when that failed, he had sought leverage first through Rebecca, now through the children. He told me yesterday that you'd taken a turn for the worse, Mason said. Made it sound as if you were dying. Rebecca's eyes flashed with anger. Of course he did. He needs the children under his control to pressure you. She squeezed Mason's hand. I'm getting stronger every day, Captain Hayes. Dr. Parker says I can return home by week's end. Mason, he corrected gently, and your home is with us now, if you wish it. You and the children will be safe at my ranch. Gratitude and something more complex flickered in Rebecca's eyes. Why would you do that? Take in a sick woman and 2 children you barely know. Because Owen was my brother, Mason said simply, which makes you and the children my family. The door opened, and Emily returned proudly carrying a sprig of mint. Mrs. Simmons says this is the last from her garden, she announced. She's bringing tea now. Rebecca smiled at her daughter, holding out her arms. Come here, my love. I need another hug from my brave girl. As Emily nestled against her mother, Rebecca looked over her head at Mason, gratitude and resolution in her gaze. They had an understanding now, a shared purpose: protect the children. Thwart Thornton, honor Owen's memory. Mrs. Simmons returned with tea, followed by Dr. Parker, a white-haired man with kind eyes and a serious demeanor. He examined Rebecca briefly, then delivered his assessment. Mrs. Warren is recovering well, he informed Mason. The crisis has passed. With continued rest and proper nutrition, she should be strong enough to travel within a few days. That's good news, Mason said, relief evident in his voice. We'll prepare for your return to Prairie Creek. Dr. Parker nodded approvingly. She'll need care for some time yet. Her lungs were significantly affected. She'll have everything she needs, Mason promised, his tone leaving no room for doubt. They stayed for another hour, Emily chattering happily to her mother about Caleb's antics and Mason's cabin. Rebecca listened with a mother's hunger, drinking in every detail of the days she had missed. As they prepared to leave, promising to return the next day, she beckoned Mason closer. "Be careful," she whispered. "Thornton won't give up easily. And there are the men who work for him, rough men, not from around here." Mason nodded, understanding her warning. "We'll be vigilant." Outside, as they mounted the horse for the journey home, Emily was quiet, thoughtful. "Mom looks better than I expected," she said finally. "Mr. Thornton made it sound like she was dying." "Mr. Thornton isn't always truthful," Mason replied carefully. "He wants the gold, doesn't he? That's why he wants your land and why he's been bothering Mom." Mason glanced down at her, once again struck by her perceptiveness. "Yes," he admitted, "but he won't get it. We're going to make sure of that." The return journey to Prairie Creek was uneventful, though Mason remained alert, scanning the horizon frequently for signs of other travelers. Rebecca's warning about Thornton's men lingered in his mind. If the businessman was truly desperate to acquire the land, he might resort to more direct methods than legal maneuvering. The sun was low in the sky, painting the snow-covered prairie in hues of orange and purple, when they crested the final rise before Mason's property. In the distance, smoke rose from his cabin's chimney, a welcome sight after the long ride. As they approached, the door opened and Eleanor Quinn emerged, waving a greeting. Beside her stood a tall figure Mason recognized as Reverend Johnson, the minister from Prairie Creek's small church. "Company," Mason observed, slowing the horse. Emily straightened in the saddle. "Why is the preacher here?" "We'll find out," Mason replied, though he had his suspicions. News traveled fast in small communities, and their journey to Oak Ridge wouldn't have gone unnoticed. Eleanor hurried to meet them as they dismounted. "How is Rebecca?" she asked without preamble. "Better than Thornton claimed," Mason answered. "The fever has broken. Doctor thinks she can travel in a few days." Relief crossed Eleanor's weathered features. "Thank the Lord. That man's lies know no bounds." Reverend Johnson approached more sedately, his expression grave beneath his gray beard. "Mr. Hayes," he greeted formally. "Miss Emily." "Reverend," Mason acknowledged. "What brings you out this way?" The minister glanced at Emily, then back to Mason. "Perhaps we might speak privately." Mason nodded, understanding. "Emily, why don't you go check on Caleb? I'm sure he's missed you." The girl looked between the adults, clearly aware they wanted her out of earshot. But she complied, hurrying into the cabin where her brother waited. Once she was gone, Reverend Johnson spoke frankly. "There's talk in town, Hayes, about you and the Warren children." "What kind of talk?" Mason asked, though he could guess. "Concerns about propriety. A single man taking in a young girl and infant. Some find it unusual." Mason's jaw tightened. "These children are my family, Reverend. My brother's children." The minister's eyebrows rose. "Brother Owen Warren was your brother." "Half-brother," Mason clarified. "Same father, different mothers. We discovered the connection during the war." Johnson absorbed this, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "That changes matters somewhat. Blood relation provides a more acceptable arrangement." "I don't much care what's acceptable," Mason replied bluntly. "These children need protection from Thornton, among others." Eleanor, who had been listening with arms crossed, interjected, "Henry Thornton has been in church all day praying loudly about his concern for the poor Warren orphans and their unfortunate situation, making quite a show of his Christian charity." Mason wasn't surprised. Thornton was laying groundwork, shaping public opinion ahead of the hearing. The children aren't orphans, he pointed out. Their mother is recovering. She'll be joining us here when she's well enough to travel. Reverend Johnson's expression shifted to one of surprised approval. Mrs. Warren will be staying here with you. Yes, she needs care while she recovers, and the children need their mother. The minister nodded slowly. A family unit. That would indeed address many of the concerns being raised. Mason understood the implication. In the eyes of the community, a household with both a man and woman would be more acceptable than his current arrangement with the children. The fact that Rebecca wasn't his wife would raise eyebrows, but less so than his current situation. Mrs. Warren and I have an understanding, Mason said carefully. We're going to protect these children together. Eleanor smiled slightly, a knowing look in her eyes that Mason chose to ignore. Reverend Johnson, however, seemed satisfied for the moment. I shall inform the congregation that arrangements are being made for the children's proper care, he declared, and that their mother is thankfully recovering. After the minister left, Eleanor lingered, helping Mason unsaddle the horse and tend to evening chores. As they worked, she spoke candidly. That man means well, but he's blind to the real threat. Thornton has half the town convinced you're unsuitable to care for those children. And the other half? Mason asked. Eleanor snorted. The other half know Thornton too well to believe anything he says, but they're the quiet ones, the ones who won't speak up at a hearing. Inside the cabin, Emily had settled into caring for Caleb, changing his wrappings and feeding him with the practiced hands of a little mother. The baby gurgled happily at the sight of his sister, tiny hands reaching for her familiar face. He missed you, Eleanor observed, watching them fondly. Cried for a good hour after you left. Nothing would settle him until I took him outside to watch the road, as if he were looking for you. Emily beamed with pride, nuzzling her brother's cheek. I missed him too. But I got to see Mom. She's getting better, Mrs. Quinn. She'll be coming home soon. That's wonderful news, dear. Eleanor gathered her shawl, preparing to leave. I'll come by tomorrow to help prepare for her arrival. A sick room needs special arrangements. After she departed, Mason and Emily settled into their evening routine. He prepared a simple supper while she played with Caleb on a blanket near the fire. The domesticity of the scene struck Mason anew, how quickly he had adjusted to their presence, how empty the cabin would feel without them now. Mason, Emily's voice broke into his thoughts. Can I ask you something? Of course. She hesitated, focusing on Caleb's tiny fingers wrapped around her own. When Mom comes to stay with us, will we still be welcome here? Or will you want your house back to yourself? The question revealed her deeper fear that their current arrangement was temporary, that they might still face separation or displacement. Mason set aside the stew he was stirring and knelt beside her. Emily, listen to me, he said gently but firmly. This is your home now. Yours, Caleb's, and your mother's, for as long as you want it to be. But it's your house, she pointed out with a child's literal thinking. It's just a building, Mason replied. Home is something else. It's people who care for each other, who protect each other. He glanced around the cabin at the small signs of their presence that had already transformed it. The diapers drying near the fire, Emily's drawings tacked to the wall, the sense of life that had returned to spaces long empty. I think this place has been waiting for a family to make it a home again. Emily considered this, her young face solemn. Like you were waiting too? The perception in her question caught Mason off guard. Had he been waiting, existing rather than living these past 5 years, going through the motions of survival without purpose or connection? Maybe I was, he admitted. without knowing it. Emily nodded, satisfied with his answer. "I'm glad we found you," she said, simply returning her attention to Caleb. Later, after the children were asleep, Mason sat at the table with Owen's letters spread before him. He hadn't read them in years, but now he searched through them for any mention of the gold, any clue that might help defend against Thornton's machinations. Most were personal Owen's thoughts on the war, his hopes for the future, his joy at discovering Mason was his brother. But one, dated a month before his death, contained a passage that caught Mason's attention. "I've confirmed what I suspected about the creek on your land. The samples showed promise. This could change everything for both our families, brother. I've documented everything carefully should anything happen to me, pal. Rebecca knows where to find the papers. Trust her. She's stronger than she appears." Mason sat back the letter, trembling slightly in his hand. Owen had known he was dying. When he wrote this, was already making arrangements, entrusting Rebecca with information that could secure his family's future. According to Rebecca, those documents were hidden in their house in Prairie Creek, the very place Thornton had likely been searching while Rebecca was in Oak Ridge and the children were alone. Had he found them already? Or had Emily and Caleb's unexpected departure for Mason's cabin interrupted his search? Either way, they needed those papers before the hearing. They provided proof of Thornton's deception, and more importantly, evidence that the discovery rightfully belonged to Mason as the landowner. Tomorrow, Mason decided he would need to visit the Warren home and retrieve Owen's hidden documents. With Rebecca's blessing and Emily's help to locate the precise hiding spot, he could secure the evidence they needed to confront Thornton. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the distant howling of coyotes across the prairie. Mason returned the letters to their box, his resolve strengthening. Owen had protected this knowledge with his life, entrusting it to Rebecca for safekeeping. Now it fell to Mason to use it to protect Owen's children from the man who would exploit them for gain. "I won't fail them again, brother," he whispered to the quiet room. "This time, I'll see it through." Morning brought fresh snow and a leaden sky that promised more before day's end. Mason rose early, building up the fire and preparing for the day ahead. They would need to visit the Warren home, then make another journey to Oak Ridge to update Rebecca on their findings. Emily joined him at the breakfast table, her hair mussed from sleep, but her eyes alert. "Are we going to see Mom again today?" "Yes," Mason confirmed. "But first we need to stop at your house. Your mother told me about some important papers your father left there, documents we need for the hearing with Judge Wilson." Emily nodded, immediately understanding. "About the gold in the creek?" "Yes, do you think you can help me find them? Your mother said they're under a floorboard beneath your bed." The girl's face lit with purpose. "I know exactly where Dad showed me once, said it was our special secret." After breakfast, Mason bundled the children warmly against the cold. Caleb would need to come with them this time. Eleanor was visiting her daughter in a neighboring township and wouldn't return until evening. They took the wagon, which was slower but safer for traveling with an infant. Emily sat beside Mason on the bench, holding Caleb securely in her lap, her small face serious beneath her woolen hat. The Warren home stood on the outskirts of Prairie Creek, a modest cabin smaller than Mason's with a lean-to blacksmith shop attached where Owen had plied his trade after returning from the war. The property looked neglected, with snow piled against the doors and windows, no smoke rising from the chimney to indicate habitation. "Looks cold," Emily observed as they approached, a note of sadness in her voice. "We'll warm it up," Mason assured her, though he had no intention of staying longer than necessary. The place held too many memories for Emily, too many reminders of her father's death and her mother's struggles. He helped her down from the wagon, then lifted Caleb, now awake and alert, his dark eyes taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. The front door was locked, but Emily led them around to the back, where she retrieved a key hidden beneath a stone. "Mom always keeps it here," she explained, unlocking the door with practiced ease. Inside the cabin was cold but tidy. Rebecca had clearly maintained order even as circumstances grew dire. A table with 4 chairs, a small cooking area, a curtained-off sleeping section, all the basic necessities for a family of modest means. Emily handed Caleb to Mason, then moved purposefully toward a narrow bed in the corner, her bed, presumably. "It's under here," she said, kneeling and feeling along the floorboards. "Dad showed me how to find it." Her small fingers located a nearly invisible seam in the wooden floor. She pressed one end, causing the opposite end to rise slightly, then carefully lifted the board to reveal a shallow space beneath. "See," she said proudly, reaching into the hiding place, "our secret spot." She withdrew a leather portfolio, worn but well-maintained, and handed it to Mason. "Dad used to write in this all the time after he got home from the war. He said it was important work." Mason set Caleb on a blanket on the table, then opened the portfolio with careful hands. Inside were detailed survey maps of Prairie Creek and the surrounding area, focusing particularly on Mason's property. Neat notations marked various points along the creek, with samples apparently taken at regular intervals. A separate document contained the assayer's report. Owen had mentioned confirmation of gold deposits in the creek bed, not in vast quantities but sufficient for profitable extraction with proper equipment. The report was dated just 2 weeks before Owen's death. Most damning of all was a letter from James Mercer Thornton's brother-in-law, inquiring about Owen's findings and offering to purchase the survey results before they become public knowledge. The letter was dated after Owen's death and addressed to Rebecca, proving Thornton had known about the gold for years. "This is exactly what we needed," Mason told Emily, carefully returning the documents to the portfolio. "Your father was very thorough." Emily beamed with pride. "Dad said always do a job right, or don't do it at all." "Wise words," Mason agreed, tucking the portfolio inside his coat. "Now, let's get back to—" The sound of approaching horses interrupted him. Mason moved swiftly to the window, peering cautiously through the frost-edged glass. 3 riders were approaching the cabin, unfamiliar men with the hard look of hired guns. And leading them, sitting tall in an expensive saddle, was Henry Thornton. "Emily," Mason said quietly, stepping back from the window. "Take Caleb and go into the back room. Stay there until I call for you." The girl's eyes widened in alarm, but she obeyed without question, gathering her brother and disappearing behind the curtain that separated the sleeping area from the main room. Mason considered their options. The men hadn't spotted the wagon yet, hidden as it was behind the lean-to. If he confronted them directly, he risked a confrontation with armed men while the children were present. If he hid, they might search the house and find them anyway. Decision made, he moved to the back door, opening it silently. "Emily," he whispered urgently. "We're leaving. Now. Quietly." She appeared immediately. Caleb clutched to her chest. "Is it Mr. Thornton?" "Yes, hurry." They slipped out the back door just as knocking sounded at the front. Mason led them around the side of the house, keeping low and using the woodpile as cover. The wagon was 20 yards away, too far to reach without being seen. "We'll have to go on foot," Mason murmured. "Into the trees behind the blacksmith shop." "Ready." Emily nodded, her face pale but determined. Mason took Caleb from her, knowing she could move faster, unburdened. "Run when I say straight for the trees. Don't look back." The voices from the front of the house grew louder. Thornton was ordering his men to check around back. It was now or never. "Run!" Mason urged, and Emily bolted, her small form darting across the open space toward the shelter of the pine trees beyond the shop. Mason followed, cradling Caleb against his chest to muffle any sounds the baby might make. They had covered half the distance when a shout went up behind them. There by the trees! A gunshot cracked through the winter air, the bullet splintering bark from a tree trunk near Emily's head. The girl stumbled in fear, but kept running, reaching the tree line seconds before Mason. "Keep going," he urged as they plunged into the relative safety of the pines. "Stay low." More shouts behind them, the sound of horses being mounted. Mason knew they couldn't outrun mounted men for long, especially not with children in the bitter cold. They needed a plan. "This way?" Emily gasped, tugging at his coat. "There's a place Dad showed me. A hiding spot." Mason followed her lead, trusting her knowledge of the area. They moved deeper into the trees, the sounds of pursuit growing more distant, as the thick pines muffled noise and obscured tracks. Emily led them to a small rise barely noticeable in the forest floor. "Here," she panted, brushing away snow to reveal a trap door cleverly disguised with earth and pine needles. "Dad's hunting blind." Mason helped her lift the door, revealing a small space dug into the hillside just large enough for a man to sit and wait for game, or for a family to hide from danger. They climbed down, pulling the door closed above them, plunging them into darkness, save for thin beams of light filtering through deliberate gaps in the structure. "Dad built it," Emily whispered, her breath clouding in the cold air. "For hunting, but also," he said, "sometimes a man needs a place to think that no one else knows about." Mason nodded, impressed by Owen's foresight. The space was well constructed with a small bench, a cache of emergency supplies, blankets, matches, jerky, and even a tiny ventilation shaft that prevented their breath from creating a visible plume outside. They huddled together for warmth, wrapping the emergency blankets around themselves and Caleb, who remained remarkably quiet, as if sensing the need for silence. Through the viewing slits, Mason could see glimpses of their pursuers moving through the trees, searching with increasing frustration. "They're getting farther away," he observed after nearly an hour of tense waiting, searching in the wrong direction. "What do we do now?" Emily asked, her voice small but steady. Mason considered their situation. They couldn't return to the Warren house or risk retrieving their wagon. Thornton's men would be watching both. They couldn't travel all the way to Mason's cabin on foot, not with Caleb, and not in the worsening weather. "We need to get to Oak Ridge," he decided. "To your mother. Once Thornton realizes we have the documents, you and Caleb won't be safe until we've exposed his plans." "But how? It's so far." Mason checked the position of the sun through the trees. "There's a stage road about 2 miles east of here. If we can reach it, we might flag down a passing wagon or the afternoon stage to Oak Ridge." Emily nodded gravely, accepting the plan. "I can walk 2 miles, she said with determination. "And I'll carry Caleb when your arms get tired." Mason smiled despite the gravity of their situation. "You're a brave girl, Emily Warren. Your father would be proud." They waited until certain Thornton's men had moved on, then cautiously emerged from the hunting blind. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional call of a winter bird and the soft crunch of snow beneath their boots. Moving steadily eastward, Mason carried Caleb while keeping a watchful eye on Emily, who trudged through the snow with remarkable endurance for one so young. They spoke little, conserving energy and remaining alert for any sign of pursuit. The journey was arduous. The snow had deepened since morning, and the temperature continued to drop as afternoon wore on. Caleb, initially content, began to fuss with hunger and discomfort. "We need to stop," Mason said, finally noticing Emily's increasing fatigue and Caleb's distress. "Just long enough to rest and feed him." They found shelter beneath a large pine, its branches creating a relatively snow-free space near the trunk. Mason used the emergency blanket to create a windbreak, while Emily prepared a bottle for Caleb, using supplies they had fortunately brought with them. As the baby nursed hungrily, Emily leaned against Mason's side, seeking warmth. "Do you think Mr. Thornton would really have hurt us?" she asked quietly. Mason considered the question, wanting to reassure her, but unwilling to lie. "I don't think he would harm you or Caleb directly," he said carefully, "but he's desperate to get your father's documents. Desperate men can be dangerous." Emily nodded thoughtfully. "Dad always said to be careful of men who want things too badly. He said greed makes them blind." "Your father was a wise man," Mason observed. "Is that why you live alone?" Emily asked suddenly. "Because you don't want things?" The question caught Mason off guard. "I wasn't always alone," he reminded her gently. "I had a family once, but after they died, you stayed alone until we came." Jason stared into the distance, considering her observation. "After I lost Sarah and the girls, I didn't want to feel that kind of pain again. Being alone seemed safer." "But weren't you lonely?" "Yes," he admitted. "Very lonely." Emily was quiet for a moment, digesting this. "I think being alone is scarier than being hurt," she said finally, with the simple wisdom of a child who had faced both. Before Mason could respond, the distant sound of hoofbeats reached them. He tensed, pulling Emily and Caleb closer behind the windbreak, but the sound was coming from the east, from the direction of the stage road. "Wait here," he instructed, making sure they were well hidden. "I'm going to see who it is." Moving cautiously through the trees, Mason made his way toward the sound. Through a break in the pines, he glimpsed the stage road about 100 yards distant, and on it, a solitary rider heading toward Prairie Creek. The horseman was familiar, the broad shoulders and distinctive hat marking him as Sheriff Miller. Mason's mind raced. The sheriff was no friend of Thornton's, but neither was he an ally. Still, he represented law and authority, which might be their best protection at the moment. Decision made, Mason broke cover and hurried toward the road, waving to catch the sheriff's attention. "Miller," he called. "Sheriff Miller." The lawman reined in, hand instinctively moving to his sidearm before recognizing Mason. "Hayes," he called in surprise. "What in blazes are you doing out here on foot?" Mason approached, breathing hard from his dash through the snow. "Thornton and his men came after us at the Warren place. Fired shots. We had to flee into the woods." Miller's bushy eyebrows rose in alarm. "Shots fired at you and the children?" "Yes, they're safe sheltering in the trees, but Caleb's hungry and cold. We need to get to Oak Ridge." The sheriff's expression hardened. "Get the young'uns. You can ride double with me to the Sanders farm a mile south. They'll lend you a wagon to reach Oak Ridge." "Thank you," Mason said with genuine gratitude. "But there's something you should know. Thornton's after documents proving he's known about gold deposits on my land for years. That's why he wants guardianship of the Warren children leverage to force me to sell." Miller's eyes narrowed. "Gold on your property. That's a serious claim, Hayes." "I have proof," Mason said, patting the portfolio secured inside his coat. "Owen Warren's survey records and correspondence with Thornton's brother-in-law." The sheriff considered this, clearly weighing his responsibilities. "This is a matter for Judge Wilson," he said finally. "But firing at children, that's something else entirely. Get your charges, Hayes. I'll see you safely to Oak Ridge, and we'll sort this out proper." Relief flooded through Mason. With the sheriff's help, they could reach Rebecca and present their evidence at the hearing. Thornton's schemes would be exposed, and the children would be safe. As he turned to retrieve Emily and Caleb, Mason felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. They weren't alone in this fight anymore. Like Emily had said, being alone was sometimes scarier than being hurt. And perhaps he reflected, as he made his way back through the trees, it was time to stop being alone altogether. The Sanders farm was a welcome sight after their ordeal in the forest. John Sanders, a gruff but kind-hearted farmer, didn't ask questions when Sheriff Miller explained they needed transportation to Oak Ridge. He simply hitched his best team to a wagon, provided blankets and hot coffee, and offered his eldest son as driver. "Much obliged, Sanders," Miller said as they prepared to depart. "I'll remember this." The farmer waved away his thanks. "Anybody do the same for little ones in need. You just get 'em safe to their ma." As they traveled the road to Oak Ridge, with young Tom Sanders handling the reins and Sheriff Miller riding alongside Mason, held Emily and Caleb close beneath the blankets, grateful for the unexpected allies they had found. Emily, exhausted from their adventure, leaned against his chest, her eyes fighting to stay open. "Are we going to be safe now?" she murmured sleepily. Mason smoothed her hair, his heart full with an emotion he had not allowed himself to feel for years. Hope. "Yes," he promised. "We're going to be safe now." As the wagon rolled eastward beneath the darkening sky, Mason thought of Rebecca, waiting for them in Oak Ridge, of the home they might build together, of the family that had found him when he wasn't looking. Owen's final gift to his brother wasn't the gold in the creek, Mason realized. It was this, a chance to live again, to love again, to be more than a solitary figure, haunted by the past. "Thank you, brother," he whispered to the winter wind. And for the first time in 5 long years, the wind's answer didn't sound like sorrow. Oak Ridge emerged from the winter twilight like a collection of fireflies, each window a glowing promise of warmth against the gathering darkness. The wagon rolled steadily down the main street, its passengers huddled beneath blankets, their faces etched with exhaustion but resolute determination. Dr. Parker was attending another patient when they arrived at his home, but Mrs. Simmons recognized them immediately, her eyes widening at their bedraggled appearance. "Merciful heavens!" she exclaimed, ushering them inside. "What's happened to you all?" Sheriff Miller explained briefly, while Mason helped Emily down from the wagon, Caleb still sleeping in his arms despite the jostling journey. The baby's cheeks were flushed, his breathing slightly labored. "The little one needs warmth and nourishment," Mrs. Simmons observed, her experienced eyes assessing Caleb's condition. And the girl's half-frozen herself. Come straight upstairs to Mrs. Warren." Rebecca was sitting up in bed when they entered, a book open on her lap. At the sight of her children and Mason in their disheveled state, she dropped the book and pushed herself upright, maternal concern overwhelming her own weakness. "Emily, Caleb," she exclaimed, arms outstretched. "What's happened? Are you hurt?" Emily rushed to her mother's embrace, suddenly a child again, rather than the brave little guardian she had been all day. "Mr. Thornton tried to catch us," she explained, her voice muffled against Rebecca's shoulder. "He had men with guns. They shot at us." Rebecca's gaze flew to Mason, horror dawning in her eyes. "They fired at my children." Mason nodded grimly, transferring Caleb to her waiting arms. "After we retrieved Owen's documents from your home, Thornton and 3 men arrived just as we were leaving. We escaped through the woods." Rebecca clutched her children tightly, her face pale but resolute. She examined Caleb carefully, her nurse's training evident in her methodical assessment. "He's chilled and hungry, but otherwise unharmed," she concluded with relief. "Emily, I'm okay, Mom," the girl assured her, though she remained nestled close. "Mason kept us safe in Dad's hunting blind." A flicker of surprise crossed Rebecca's face at this detail, followed by understanding. "Owen's special place," she murmured, a private memory passing between mother and daughter. Sheriff Miller cleared his throat from the doorway. Mrs. Warren, I'll need a statement from you about these documents Hayes mentioned. He claims they prove Thornton has been pursuing your children as leverage to obtain his land for gold mining. Rebecca's chin lifted a flash of steel beneath her invalid's pallor. It's all true, Sheriff. My late husband discovered gold deposits in Prairie Creek years ago during his work as a territorial surveyor. Thornton has known about it since Owen's death, but kept it secret, waiting for an opportunity to acquire the land cheaply. These are serious allegations, Miller said carefully. Judge Wilson arrives tomorrow for the guardianship hearing. I suggest you present your evidence then with Mrs. Warren's testimony if she's strong enough. I'll be there, Rebecca declared firmly. My children's future depends on it. After the sheriff departed, promising to post a deputy outside for their protection, Mrs. Simmons brought hot soup and bread. They ate gratefully, the warm food restoring some color to Emily's cheeks and settling Caleb into a more peaceful sleep. Dr. Parker returned as they finished their meal, checking both children thoroughly. The boy has a slight congestion in his chest, he observed with concern. Nothing serious yet, but we should watch him closely. The cold exposure could develop into something worse. Rebecca's arms tightened around her son. He'll sleep with me tonight, she decided. I'll monitor his breathing. The doctor nodded approval, then turned to Mason. You should rest too, Mr. Hayes. You look dead on your feet. Mason hadn't realized how exhausted he was until that moment. The adrenaline of their escape was fading, leaving bone-deep weariness in its wake. I should keep watch, he protested weakly. The deputy will handle that, Dr. Parker assured him. I've prepared the spare room down the hall. Miss Emily can stay with her mother, and you can have a proper night's sleep before facing Judge Wilson tomorrow. Mason hesitated, reluctant to be separated from the children after the day's dangers. Emily seemed to sense his concern and slipped from her mother's side to take his hand. It's okay, she said with the simple wisdom of a child. We're safe now. Mom's here and the sheriff and Dr. Parker. Mason looked down at her upturned face, so trusting despite all she had endured. You're sure? She nodded solemnly. And tomorrow you'll stop Mr. Thornton from taking us away. Yeah, Mason promised. Tomorrow we end this. Rebecca met his gaze over their daughter's head, something unspoken passing between them, gratitude, resolve, and perhaps something more complex that neither was ready to name. Thank you, she said simply, for protecting them, for keeping Owen's promise when I couldn't. Mason nodded, words suddenly difficult. Get some rest, he managed finally. Tomorrow will be a long day. The spare room was small but comfortable, with a narrow bed and a window overlooking Oak Ridge's main street. Mason stood at the glass for a long time, watching the snow begin to fall again, dusting the town in fresh white. The deputy sheriff Miller had posted, sat on the doctor's porch below, collar turned up against the cold rifle across his knees. Mason's mind churned with the day's events and tomorrow's challenges. Thornton wouldn't surrender easily, even with the evidence against him. Men like that had resources, connections, ways of twisting truth to serve their purposes. The hearing before Judge Wilson would be a battle one Mason couldn't afford to lose. He removed Owen's portfolio from inside his coat, spreading the documents on the small table beneath the window. In the lamplight, he studied his half-brother's neat handwriting, the careful notations on the survey maps, the detailed descriptions of soil and mineral samples. Owen's thoroughness might save them all tomorrow. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. The door opened slightly to reveal Rebecca wrapped in a borrowed robe, her face pale but determined. "May I come in?" she asked quietly. Mason nodded hastily, gathering the papers. Are the children asleep? Yes, Mrs. Simmons is sitting with them. Rebecca entered, closing the door softly behind her. I wanted to speak with you privately, about tomorrow. She moved to the window, staring out at the falling snow. In profile, the resemblance to Emily was striking, the same determined chin, the same thoughtful eyes. Mason could see where the child had inherited her quiet strength. If Thornton doesn't succeed in court, Rebecca said without preamble, he may try other methods, more direct ones. I know, Mason acknowledged. Sheriff Miller will provide protection until we return to Prairie Creek. After that, he hesitated. After that, we'll need to be vigilant. Rebecca turned to face him, her expression grave. You understand what you're taking on, not just temporary guardianship of 2 children, but possibly a target on your back. Thornton isn't a man who forgets a defeat. I understand, Mason said firmly, but the land is mine, and the children are— He stopped, uncertain how to define what Emily and Caleb had become to him in such a short time. Family, Rebecca finished for him. They're your family just as Owen was. Yes, Rebecca's gaze was steady, assessing. And what am I in this arrangement? Mr. Hayes, a convenient solution to propriety concerns, the invalid mother who comes with the children you've grown to love. The directness of her question caught Mason off guard. You're Owen's widow, he said carefully. The mother of his children. That makes you family too. What's a sister-in-law by association? Rebecca observed a hint of something unreadable in her tone. I see. Mason frowned, feeling he'd somehow missed something important. What are you asking me, Mrs. Warren? Rebecca sighed some of the formality, leaving her posture. I'm asking about your intentions, Mason. Not just toward my children, but toward me. Toward us as a unit. Understanding dawned slowly. The community's concerns about propriety, Reverend Johnson's relief at hearing Rebecca would join them, the knowing look in Eleanor Quinn's eyes, all pointed to expectations about Mason and Rebecca's relationship that went beyond their connection through Owen. I hadn't thought that far ahead, he admitted honestly. My focus has been on protecting the children, securing your safety. Rebecca nodded, unsurprised. Of course. I didn't mean to presume. She moved toward the door, her momentary vulnerability replaced by practical composure. We should both rest. Tomorrow will require all our strength. Rebecca, Mason said, stopping her retreat. I'm not good at this, at possibilities. I've been alone a long time. She turned back, a small smile softening her features. So have I, Mason. So have I. With that, she slipped out, leaving him with questions he hadn't known to ask, and possibilities he hadn't dared consider. Sleep came eventually, though Mason's dreams were troubled images of floodwaters and gunshots of small hands slipping from his grasp. He woke before dawn, the room cold and gray with early light. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was, reaching instinctively for his rifle as he did each morning in his cabin. Then, memory returned. Oak Ridge, the Warren family, the hearing with Judge Wilson. Today would determine all their futures. He dressed quickly and descended to the kitchen, where Mrs. Simmons was already preparing breakfast. Early riser, she observed approvingly. Coffee's hot if you want some. Mason accepted gratefully, warming his hands around the mug. How's Caleb this morning? Better, she reported. Fever never developed, thank the Lord. He's nursing now. Rebecca and Emily are with him. Relief washed through Mason. He had feared the baby's exposure to the cold might have more serious consequences. And Dr. Parker called out at first light difficult birth at the Peterson farm. but he'll be at the hearing to testify about Rebecca's condition counter any claims Thornton might make about her inability to care for her children. Mason nodded, grateful for the doctor's support. Every ally mattered today. Sheriff Miller arrived as they finished breakfast, stamping snow from his boots in the entryway. "Judge Wilson's train got in at dawn," he announced without preamble. "Hearings set for 10 o'clock at the courthouse. Thornton's already there with his lawyer from Lincoln." A lawyer? Mason hadn't anticipated this development. "From Lincoln," Miller nodded grimly. "Expensive one, too. Seems Thornton's sparing no expense to win this case." Mason exchanged a worried glance with Rebecca, who had joined them with the children. They had evidence, but no legal representation. Would it be enough against a professional advocate? "Don't look so concerned," Miller said, catching their exchange. "Judge Wilson's a fair man. He cares more for truth than fancy legal arguments. Tell your story straight, present your evidence clear, and let him decide." It was small comfort, but they had no choice. Mason gathered Owen's portfolio while Rebecca dressed the children in their warmest clothes. The courthouse was only a short walk from Dr. Parker's home, but the winter morning was bitter, the wind cutting through their coats as they made their way down Oak Ridge's main street. The courthouse dominated the town square, a two-story brick building with white columns that seemed transported from a more populous, prosperous community. Inside the main courtroom was already filled with spectators, curious townspeople, a few familiar faces from Prairie Creek, and in the front row, Henry Thornton with a distinguished-looking gentleman in an expensive suit. Thornton's expression darkened when he spotted Mason and the Warren family. His gaze fixed on the portfolio Mason carried, recognition and alarm flashing across his features before he controlled them. "He knows we have the documents," Rebecca murmured, clutching Caleb closer. "Good," Mason replied. "Let him worry." Judge Wilson entered from a side door, a tall man with silver hair and the weathered complexion of someone who had spent years outdoors before assuming the bench. His keen eyes surveyed the courtroom as he took his seat, lingering briefly on the children before settling on Sheriff Miller. "I understand this hearing involves several matters," he began without ceremony. "A guardianship petition, allegations of violent intimidation, and potentially criminal fraud. Sheriff Miller, would you present the basic facts?" Miller stepped forward, outlining the situation concisely. Thornton's petition for guardianship of the Warren children, Mason's counterclaim based on family connection, and the recent events, including gunshots fired at Mason and the children at the Warren homestead. Judge Wilson listened attentively, his expression giving away nothing. When Miller finished, he turned to Thornton's lawyer. "Mr. Bennett, your client has petitioned for guardianship of minor children who have a living mother and an uncle by blood. On what grounds?" Bennett rose smoothly, his voice cultured and confident. "Your Honor, Mrs. Warren has demonstrated inability to provide proper care for her children. She abandoned them during severe winter weather, requiring them to seek shelter with a virtual stranger. Furthermore, she suffers from serious illness that renders her incapable of meeting their needs." "That's not true," Emily burst out, unable to contain herself. "Mom didn't abandon us. She got sick working to feed us." "Emily," Rebecca whispered, placing a restraining hand on her daughter's shoulder. Judge Wilson regarded the girl thoughtfully. "Young lady, while I appreciate your loyalty to your mother, outbursts aren't permitted in my courtroom." His tone was firm but not unkind. "You'll have a chance to speak when called upon." Emily subsided, though her small face remained indignant. The judge returned his attention to Bennett. "Continue, counselor." "As for Mr. Hayes," Bennett resumed, "while he may claim blood relation to these children, he is a reclusive individual with no experience raising children, particularly a young girl. Mr. Thornton, as a respected businessman and board member of the Lincoln Children's Home, can provide stability, education, and opportunities these children would otherwise lack. It was a compelling argument Mason had to admit. Presented this way, Thornton appeared the benevolent savior offering advantages that neither Rebecca in her illness nor Mason in his isolation could provide. Judge Wilson turned to Mason. "Mr. Hayes, you have no legal representation." "No, Your Honor," Mason replied, standing. "Just the truth." A flicker of something approval perhaps crossed the judge's face. "Then present your case." Mason took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts. He was no orator, had never been comfortable speaking to groups. But too much depended on his words now. "Your Honor, 3 nights ago, Emily Warren brought her infant brother to my door during a blizzard. Their mother, Rebecca, had fallen ill while working in Oak Ridge. The children were alone and hungry." He glanced at Emily, drawing strength from her trusting gaze. "I took them in because it was the right thing to do. Later I learned they were the children of Owen Warren, my half-brother, who I served with in the war." "You claim blood relation," Judge Wilson noted. "Can you prove this connection?" Mason nodded, withdrawing a letter from Owen's portfolio. "This is correspondence between myself and Owen, acknowledging our shared father. Emily recognized me from descriptions her father had given her and from the military pendant I carry that belonged to our regiment." The judge examined the letter, then looked to Rebecca. "Mrs. Warren, can you confirm this relationship?" Rebecca stood, Caleb cradled in her arms. "Yes, Your Honor. My late husband spoke often of his half-brother, Captain Mason Hayes. He credited Mason with saving his life at Gettysburg and expressed regret that they discovered their connection so late." Judge Wilson nodded, returning the letter to Mason. "So we have established family connection. Now regarding Mrs. Warren's alleged abandonment and inability to care for her children." Rebecca straightened, her voice steady, despite her weakened condition. "I did not abandon my children, Your Honor. I sought work in Oak Ridge when local opportunities dried up. I intended to be gone only overnight, but contracted pneumonia while working at the hotel laundry. Dr. Parker can confirm my condition and recovery." As if on cue, Dr. Parker entered the courtroom still wearing his coat, evidently having come directly from the Peterson farm. He approached the bench, apologizing for his tardiness. Before providing his medical assessment, Rebecca had indeed suffered from pneumonia, but was recovering well and would soon be capable of resuming normal activities, including childcare. "And these allegations of violence, Sheriff Miller," Judge Wilson asked, turning to the next matter. "Gunshots fired at Mr. Hayes and the Warren children." Miller recounted finding Mason and the children in the woods, their report of Thornton's men firing at them as they fled the Warren home. "Mr. Hayes believes the attack was motivated by Mr. Thornton's desire to obtain certain documents relating to gold deposits on Hayes's property." A murmur ran through the courtroom at this revelation. Judge Wilson's eyebrows rose. "Gold on whose property?" "Mine, Your Honor," Mason said, stepping forward with the portfolio. "According to surveys conducted by Owen Warren during his employment with the territorial government, there are gold deposits in Prairie Creek, which runs through my homestead." Bennett was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, this is preposterous. Mr. Hayes is attempting to distract from the matter at hand, the welfare of these children, with wild claims about gold mines and conspiracies." "Is there evidence of these deposits?" Judge Wilson asked, ignoring the lawyer's objection. Mason opened the portfolio presenting Owen's survey maps, the assayer's report, and most damning the letter from Thornton's brother-in-law attempting to purchase the information from Rebecca after Owen's death. Mr. Thornton has known about this discovery for years, Mason explained. He's been trying to acquire my land first, through direct offers, then by pressuring Mrs. Warren, and now by seeking control of her children as leverage. Thornton could remain silent no longer. Lies! He burst out, rising from his seat. These documents are forgeries. Warren was a nobody, a failed blacksmith, playing at being a surveyor. There's no gold in that worthless creek. Mr. Thornton, Judge Wilson warned, you will maintain decorum in my courtroom or be removed. But Thornton was beyond caution now, his careful facade cracking under the pressure of exposure. Hayes is the fraud, he insisted, pointing an accusing finger. A recluse, a man broken by tragedy, unfit to care for himself, let alone children. That's enough, the judge declared, banging his gavel. Mr. Thornton, one more outburst, and I'll hold you in contempt. Thornton subsided, but the damage was done. His mask of benevolence had slipped, revealing the desperation beneath. Mason could see several spectators exchanging troubled glances, reassessing the respected businessman in light of his behavior. Judge Wilson examined the documents carefully, particularly the letter from Mercer to Rebecca. This appears to establish prior knowledge of the mineral deposits, he observed, and a deliberate attempt to keep the information from becoming public. He looked up, fixing Thornton with a penetrating stare. Mr. Thornton, did you or did you not attempt to purchase these survey results from Mrs. Warren after her husband's death? Thornton glanced at his lawyer, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod. I may have expressed interest in Warren's surveying work, he admitted reluctantly, as an investment opportunity, but I had no knowledge of any gold deposits. Yet your brother-in-law specifically mentions keeping the findings confidential in this letter, Judge Wilson noted. That suggests awareness of something valuable. Bennett attempted to regain control of the situation. Your Honor, even if these allegations have merit, which we dispute, they have no bearing on Mr. Thornton's petition for guardianship. His motives for offering the Warren children a stable home are entirely charitable. Are they? Judge Wilson's tone was skeptical. Sheriff Miller, you mentioned gunshots fired at these children. Have you investigated this allegation? Miller stepped forward. Yes, Your Honor. We found fresh tracks matching multiple horses at the Warren homestead and bullet marks on trees behind the property consistent with Hayes's account of their escape route. One of my deputies is questioning known associates of Mr. Thornton as we speak. The judge's expression hardened. Firing at children crosses a line from civil dispute to criminal action, he observed. If evidence links Mr. Thornton to these shots, he'll face serious charges. Thornton paled visibly, glancing toward the courtroom doors as if contemplating flight. His lawyer placed a restraining hand on his arm, whispering urgently in his ear. Judge Wilson studied the parties before him for a long moment, his decision seemingly forming behind his thoughtful gaze. I've heard enough to rule on the guardianship petition, he announced finally. Given the established blood relationship between Mr. Hayes and the Warren children, Mrs. Warren's improving health, and the serious questions raised about Mr. Thornton's motives, I am denying the petition for guardianship. Relief washed through Mason, so powerful he nearly staggered. Beside him, Rebecca clutched his arm, tears forming in her eyes. Emily, understanding that they had won, threw her arms around Mason's waist in a fierce hug. Furthermore, Judge Wilson continued, I am ordering an investigation into the alleged mineral deposits on Mr. Hayes's property and into the gunshots fired at the Warren family. Sheriff Miller, you will secure the Warren home as a potential crime scene and take statements from all witnesses. The judge's gaze swept the courtroom, settling finally on Mason and the Warren family. Mrs. Warren, I suggest you complete your recovery at Mr. Hayes's residence as planned. The children will remain in the joint care of both of you until you are fully recovered. As for the gold deposits, if confirmed, they belong legally to Mr. Hayes as the property owner. With a final bang of his gavel, Judge Wilson closed the hearing. The courtroom erupted in conversation as he departed, spectators discussing the surprising revelations and Thornton's potential downfall. Thornton himself sat slumped in his chair, the picture of defeat. As Mason gathered the documents preparing to leave with the Warrens, Thornton raised his head, their eyes meeting across the courtroom. The businessman's gaze held no resignation, only cold fury and the promise of retribution. "It's not over," Rebecca murmured, noting the exchange. "He won't accept defeat so easily." "No," Mason agreed quietly. "But he's exposed now. The whole town knows what he tried to do. That limits his options." They left the courthouse together, stepping into the winter sunlight, with the weight of immediate danger lifted from their shoulders. Emily skipped ahead, her relief manifesting as childish exuberance, while Rebecca walked beside Mason Caleb, sleeping peacefully in her arms. "What happens now?" she asked, as they made their way back to Dr. Parker's home to collect their belongings. Mason considered the question, its implications extending far beyond their immediate plans. "We return to Prairie Creek," he said finally. "You and the children stay with me until you're fully recovered. After that—" He hesitated, uncertain how to address the unspoken possibilities between them. Rebecca saved him from his awkwardness. "After that, we'll decide together," she said simply. "One day at a time." Mason nodded, grateful for her understanding. They had weathered the immediate storm, but many questions remained about their future arrangements, about developing the gold deposits, about the family they might become. Questions that didn't need immediate answers. For now, it was enough that they were together, that the children were safe, that Owen's discovery would benefit his family as he had intended. The rest would unfold in its own time. The journey back to Prairie Creek took place 2 days later, after Dr. Parker pronounced Rebecca strong enough to travel. Sheriff Miller provided an escort himself and a deputy as protection against any final desperate action by Thornton or his men. They traveled in a borrowed wagon well supplied with blankets, hot bricks for warmth, and provisions from the grateful doctor and his wife. The weather had moderated slightly, the bitter cold giving way to a milder, sunny day that hinted at the distant promise of spring. Emily chattered excitedly throughout the journey, pointing out landmarks to her mother, describing Mason's cabin and the creek where the gold lay hidden beneath ice and stone. Caleb, fully recovered from his ordeal, gurgled happily in Rebecca's lap, reaching occasionally for passing snowflakes with wonder in his dark eyes. Mason drove the wagon, his rifle across his knees, a precaution Sheriff Miller had insisted upon. Though Thornton had left Oak Ridge the previous day, reportedly returning to Lincoln, his threat lingered like storm clouds on the horizon. Until they were certain of his whereabouts and intentions, vigilance remained necessary. They reached Mason's cabin by mid-afternoon smoke, already rising from the chimney. Eleanor Quinn had come ahead to prepare for their arrival, stocking the larder and warming the house. She greeted them at the door, her weathered face creasing with genuine pleasure at the sight of Rebecca. "There you are at last," she declared, embracing the younger woman carefully. "I've been telling these children their mother would return, and here you are proving me right." Rebecca smiled, returning the embrace with real affection. "Thank you for caring for them, Eleanor. I won't forget your kindness." "Nonsense." Eleanor dismissed the gratitude with a wave. "Neighbors help neighbors. That's the prairie way." She turned to Mason with a knowing smile. "I've aired out the back room for Mrs. Warren and the little ones, put fresh linens on the bed, and hung curtains for privacy. Mason nodded gratefully. The cabin's layout was limited: his own bed in one corner of the main room, the girls' beds in another. The back room had been used for storage since Sarah's death, but it would serve as a proper bedroom for Rebecca and Caleb, offering the privacy a grown woman needed. Sheriff Miller declined Eleanor's invitation to stay for supper, eager to return to town before dark. "I'll send word when we've news of Thornton," he promised as he departed. "Meanwhile, keep that rifle handy, Hayes." As the sheriff's wagon disappeared down the snow-covered track, Mason felt a curious sensation. The cabin behind him, filled with voices and movement, felt suddenly unmistakably like home. Not the empty shell it had been for 5 years, but a living space, warm with human presence. Inside, Eleanor was showing Rebecca around the cabin, pointing out where things were kept, offering suggestions for arrangements. Emily had already resumed her place by the fire, playing with Caleb on a blanket, her small face alight with contentment at having her family reunited. "Your cabin has good bones," Eleanor was saying as Mason entered. "Solid construction, tight against the wind. Just needs a woman's touch here and there." Rebecca caught Mason's eye over Eleanor's head, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. There was humor there, but something else too: consideration, assessment, as if she were truly seeing the space as a potential home, not merely temporary shelter. The evening passed in domestic harmony that felt both strange and familiar to Mason. Eleanor and Rebecca prepared supper together, the older woman clearly approving of Rebecca's capable hands and practical knowledge. Emily set the table without being asked, proudly showing her mother how Mason had taught her to fold the napkins. After the meal, as darkness settled over the prairie and the wind rose in familiar mournful tones around the cabin eaves, Eleanor prepared to leave. Mason offered to drive her home, but she refused. "My grandson's waiting at the end of your lane with our wagon," she explained. "Arranged it earlier. No need for you to leave your family tonight." Your family. The words lingered in the air after she departed, neither Mason nor Rebecca acknowledging them directly, but both clearly aware of their implications. Were they a family now? Could they become one built not on conventional foundations, but on shared connection to Owen, on mutual need, on growing respect, and perhaps, in time, deeper feelings? Rebecca put the children to bed first, Emily in what had been Lily's bed, Caleb in his drawer cradle nearby. Mason could hear her soft voice as she sang them to sleep, a lullaby his own mother had sung generations of frontier women, passing the same comfort to their children. When she emerged, closing the curtain that separated the sleeping area from the main room, she found Mason at the table, Owen's portfolio open before him. The survey maps and documents were spread out, the lamplight illuminating the promise of gold that had nearly cost them everything. "What will you do with it?" Rebecca asked quietly, taking the chair opposite him. "The gold, I mean." Mason traced the creek's path on the map with his finger. "I'm not sure. I know nothing about mining, about extraction." "You could sell the land after all," she suggested. "Now that its true value is known, you could command a fair price. Enough to start fresh somewhere else." He looked up, studying her face in the lamplight. "Is that what you want? To leave Prairie Creek?" Rebecca considered the question seriously. "I came here with Owen, made a life here. But lately there's been more sorrow than joy in this place." She glanced toward the curtained alcove where the children slept. "What matters is their future, their happiness, and yours." "And yours," Mason added quietly. She smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her tired face. "Yes, and mine. But I've learned that happiness isn't about places, Mason. It's about people, the ones we choose to build our lives around." The implication hung between them, neither quite ready to address it directly. Instead, Mason returned to the practical matter at hand. I could hire experts, he mused, develop the creek properly, ensure it's done right, not just for profit, but to preserve the land. Rebecca nodded approvingly. Owen would have wanted that. He loved this land, saw its beauty as well as its potential. We could build a proper house, Mason continued, the idea taking shape as he spoke. On the rise overlooking the creek, room for the children to grow. We? Rebecca questioned softly. Mason met her gaze directly, knowing it was time to address what had remained unspoken between them. I've been thinking about what you asked in Oak Ridge, about my intentions. She waited, neither encouraging nor discouraging his words. I'm not good with feelings, he admitted. Haven't allowed myself many since Sarah died, but these past days with Emily and Caleb with you. He paused, searching for the right words. It's like waking up after a long sleep, remembering what it means to care, to connect. And what does that mean for us? Rebecca asked, her voice steady, though her fingers trembled slightly on the tabletop. Mason covered her hand with his own, the gesture tentative but deliberate. It means I'd like you to stay, not just until you're recovered, but after, all of you. We could make a life here together. As what, Mason housekeeper and children tenants, or something else? As family, he said simply. Whatever form that takes, whatever grows between us over time. Rebecca turned her hand beneath his, their fingers intertwining naturally. Owen used to say you were a man of few words, but deep feelings. He talked about me, Mason asked, surprised. Often? Especially near the end. She smiled at the memory. He made me promise that if I ever met you, I'd look beyond the gruff exterior. He said there was no better man to have at your side in troubled times. The praise from his half-brother, delivered years after his death, affected Mason profoundly. He had failed to protect Owen in life, had missed the chance to know him as a brother should. But now perhaps he could honor Owen's memory by protecting what he had loved most, his family. I'm not proposing marriage, Mason clarified, not wanting to presume too much. Not yet. We hardly know each other. But I'm offering a place, a partnership, a chance to see what might develop between us for the children's sake and our own. Rebecca considered his words, her practical nature weighing possibilities and concerns. People will talk, she observed. A widow and her children living with a bachelor, no matter the family connection. Let them talk, Mason replied with unexpected vehemence. We know the truth of our arrangement. And if I want more eventually, a real marriage, not just a practical arrangement. The directness of her question startled him, but Mason appreciated her honesty. Then we'll consider it, he said simply. When the time comes, I'm not opposed to the idea, Rebecca, just cautious. I've lost one family. The thought of risking my heart again is... He trailed off, unable to articulate the depth of his fear. I understand, she assured him, squeezing his hand. I've lost too. We both need time. But I appreciate your honesty and your offer. She smiled, a touch of mischief lightening her expression. I accept your non-proposal, Mason Hayes. We'll stay, help develop the Gold Creek and see what the future holds. Relief and something warmer flooded through Mason. It wasn't a conventional arrangement, not the tidy resolution society might prefer. But it was honest, and it held promise for healing, for growth, for second chances. Then it settled, he said, returning her smile with one of his own, rusty from disuse, but genuine. They sat together a while longer, hands still joined, discussing practical matters, how to arrange the cabin for greater comfort, when to begin investigating the gold deposits, how to handle curious neighbors, and inevitable gossip. The conversation flowed easily between them, two capable adults forming a partnership based on mutual respect and shared purpose. Eventually, Rebecca's fatigue became evident, her recovery still incomplete. Mason saw her to the back room he had prepared awkwardly, wishing her good night at the doorway. It was strange having another adult in his space, after so many years alone, but not unwelcome. As he banked the fire for the night and prepared for sleep himself, Mason felt a peculiar lightness, as if a burden he had carried for years had begun to lift. Not gone entirely, perhaps never completely absent, but lighter, manageable. He thought of Sarah and the girls of the family he had lost, wondering if they would approve of this new beginning. Sarah had been practical, loving, unselfish. She would want him to live to love again, to offer shelter to those who needed it. He could almost hear her voice on the prairie wind, not sorrowful now, but encouraging, releasing him from the prison of his grief. Sleep came more easily than it had in years, deep and dreamless. Mason woke to sunlight streaming through the cabin windows and the unfamiliar but welcome sounds of life. Rebecca's voice soft in the kitchen area, Emily's higher tones asking questions, Caleb's occasional happy gurgle. For a moment, he lay still, absorbing the reality of his transformed home. Then he rose, ready to face the day, the future, the possibility of joy he had thought forever lost. Spring arrived on the prairie with sudden, startling beauty. The snow retreated, revealing tender green shoots beneath. Prairie Creek swelled with meltwater, rushing clear and cold over the rocks that concealed its golden secret. Birds returned from southern journeys, filling the air with song and purpose. The cabin had been transformed as surely as the landscape. Curtains hung at windows, long left bare, rag rugs softened the plank floors, and flowers, first the dried arrangements Rebecca created from stored grasses, then fresh wild blooms Emily gathered, adorned the table and shelves. The back room had become a proper bedroom for Rebecca and Caleb, while Emily continued to sleep in what had been Lily's bed, now adorned with a quilt Rebecca had salvaged from their old home. Mason remained in his corner of the main room, though Eleanor had tactfully suggested that proper arrangements might eventually require expansion of the cabin. Word of the gold in Prairie Creek had spread, bringing inevitable changes to the quiet community. Surveyors and mining engineers had visited, confirming Owen's discovery and helping Mason develop a plan for responsible extraction. The initial work had begun: test shafts, water diversion preparations, equipment ordered from Denver. Thornton had not returned to Prairie Creek. According to Sheriff Miller, he had departed for California after the disastrous hearing, his reputation in Nebraska damaged beyond repair. His brother-in-law, James Mercer, had resigned from the Territorial Survey Office amid accusations of impropriety. The immediate threat had passed, though Mason maintained his vigilance, unwilling to be caught unprepared again. Rebecca had recovered fully, her natural vigor returning with the spring sunshine. She had established herself in the community anew, not as the struggling widow, but as a respected nurse whose skills were increasingly sought by neighboring families. Dr. Parker from Oak Ridge had provided medical texts and supplies, encouraging her to develop her natural abilities. The children thrived in the stability of their new arrangement. Emily had begun formal lessons with Rebecca each morning, showing a quick mind and eager curiosity. Caleb, now crawling and babbling, explored the cabin and yard with determined energy, supervised by whoever was nearest Mason as often as Rebecca or Emily. It was Caleb who brought about the moment that changed everything. On a mild April afternoon, as Mason repaired fencing near the cabin, the baby had escaped Emily's watchful eye and crawled determinedly toward his location. Reaching Mason, Caleb pulled himself upright, using Mason's boot for support, then took his first wobbling steps, arms outstretched in perfect trust. "Mason!" Emily called excitedly from the cabin porch. "Look! He's walking!" Mason dropped his tools, kneeling to receive the tottering infant. Caleb managed 3 unsteady steps before falling forward into Mason's waiting hands, his small face triumphant. "Well done, little man," Mason praised, swinging the baby up into his arms. "That's the way." Rebecca appeared in the doorway, alerted by Emily's exclamation. She watched as Mason carried Caleb back toward the cabin, the baby perched on his shoulders, tiny hands buried in Mason's hair for balance. The sight affected her profoundly. This man, who had once shut himself away from all human connection, now open-heartedly embracing her son, her children, their shared life. That evening, after the children were asleep, Rebecca joined Mason on the porch. The night was mild, the sky ablaze with stars, the air fragrant with spring growth. They sat in comfortable silence for a time, listening to the distant chorus of frogs from the creek. "I received a letter from Reverend Johnson today," Rebecca said finally. "He's concerned about our living arrangement, as he puts it. Suggests it sets a poor example for the children and the community." Mason snorted softly. "Reverend Johnson should mind his own business." "It is his business in a way," Rebecca pointed out reasonably, "as spiritual leader of the community. And he's not wrong, Mason. Our situation is unconventional." Mason turned to study her face in the starlight. Over the past months, he had come to know its expressions, to read the thoughts behind her eyes. What he saw now was not distress, but determination, a decision already made. "What are you saying, Rebecca?" She met his gaze directly. "I'm saying it's time to formalize our arrangement for the children's sake, and our own. I'm saying I want more than partnership, Mason. I want a marriage, a complete family." The declaration hung between them honest and unhurried. They had lived side by side for months now, learning each other's habits, strengths, flaws. What had begun as an arrangement of necessity had evolved into something deeper: respect, friendship, and gradually love. Not the impetuous passion of youth, but something steadier, more enduring. "Are you proposing to me, Rebecca Warren?" Mason asked, a smile tugging at his mouth. She laughed softly. "I suppose I am. Someone had to take the initiative, and you've been remarkably slow about it." "Cautious," he corrected, taking her hand, "wanting to be sure, for all of us." "And are you sure now?" she asked, suddenly serious. Mason considered the question, giving it the weight it deserved. Was he ready to commit fully, to embrace this second chance at family, at love? The face of his first wife rose in his mind, Sarah, who had been his youth, his first love, the mother of his daughters. But alongside that memory stood his present reality, Rebecca, strong and capable, who understood loss, who had brought life back into his empty spaces. "Yes," he said simply. "I'm sure." The certainty in his voice dispelled any lingering doubt in Rebecca's expression. She leaned forward, bridging the distance between them, in a kiss, their first tentative, but full of promise. When they separated, Mason kept hold of her hand. "I should warn you," he said with mock seriousness, "that you're marrying into sudden wealth. The first shipment of ore from the creek has already paid for expanding the cabin and establishing a proper trust for the children's education." Rebecca's eyes widened. "You didn't tell me the mining had progressed so quickly." "I wanted to be sure before making promises," he explained. "The engineers confirm Owen's assessment. It's not a massive deposit, but it's rich enough to provide security for generations. Your children and perhaps—" He hesitated, then continued, "and perhaps others if they come along." The implication warmed Rebecca's cheeks, visible even in the starlight. Others would be welcome, she said softly. In time, Mason nodded, understanding her meaning. They had years ahead for their family to grow, for wounds to heal completely, for love to deepen and expand. For now, it was enough to have reached this moment of decision, of commitment. Inside the cabin, Emily's voice called out in her sleep, a wordless murmur that gradually settled back into peaceful breathing. Rebecca listened, the instinctive alertness of a mother never fully at rest. "She has nightmares sometimes," she explained, "about the day Thornton's men shot at them, about losing me or you." "I know," Mason said quietly. "She comes to check on me afterward, makes sure I'm still here, still real." The admission touched Rebecca deeply. "You've become her safe harbor," she observed, "the foundation she builds her security upon." "I try to be," Mason said simply, "for both of them and for you." Rebecca leaned against his shoulder, content in the certainty of their shared future. "When shall we tell the children about our decision?" "Tomorrow," Mason suggested. "We'll make it a celebration. Perhaps invite Eleanor and some of the neighbors. Do things properly, as the Reverend would say." Rebecca chuckled at his dry tone. "Yes, let's scandalize the community by behaving respectably." How revolutionary. They sat together a while longer, planning their announcement, their wedding, the expansion of the cabin that would give them all proper space. The creek murmured in the distance, its waters carrying both the legacy of Owen's discovery and the promise of their future. When they finally rose to go inside, Mason paused at the door, looking back at the star-strewn sky and the dark outline of the prairie stretching to the horizon. 5 years ago, he had thought his life effectively over, had existed, rather than lived a shadow moving through empty days. Now the cabin behind him held light, warmth, purpose, family. "Coming?" Rebecca asked, holding the door. Mason nodded, turning away from the night to enter the home they had created together. "Yes," he said simply. "I'm home." As the door closed behind them, the wind carried the faint sound of the creek, its waters flowing ever onward, bearing gold in its depths, just as life carried possibility for those willing to search for it, to claim it, to cherish its value. On the hillside overlooking the cabin where Mason had once buried Owen's documents and where his own family lay at rest, wildflowers nodded in the gentle breeze, nature's testament to renewal, to life's persistence, to hope's quiet, stubborn endurance through the harshest seasons. The prairie sang its ancient wordless song beneath the stars, a melody of loss and finding, of endings and beginnings, of solitary journeys that somehow unexpectedly lead home.